Chapter 1. Introduction, Fire of Modernity. When you think about the history of the 20th century, there are few moments that have changed the world in such a fundamental way as the invention and use of the atomic weapon. The dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 marked not only the end of World War II, but also the beginning of a new age, the nuclear age. For the first time in human history, man possessed a weapon capable of wiping out not only armies or cities, but theoretically the entire civilization. In one fell swoop, technological development had reached a point where the relationship between man, nature, and war had to be completely rethought. Since then, nuclear weapons have embodied the paradox of modernity. They stand for progress in science, for genius and creativity, but at the same time for the most destructive force ever created by human hands. The fascination and horror associated with these weapons are fed by several sources. On the one hand, they embody the triumph of the natural sciences. Decades of theoretical physics, which initially originated in academic lecture halls and laboratories, were condensed in a very short time into a practical technology of tremendous impact. On the other hand, they reveal the abysses of human politics and morality, because they were not developed in a vacuum, but in a context of fear, war, and the desire for power. The fact that it was ultimately political decision-makers who determined the use of these weapons illustrates how closely science and power became intertwined in the 20th century. The history of nuclear weapons is therefore never only a history of technology, but always also a history of the people who designed, used, or wanted to prevent it. Even in the first days after Hiroshima, it was clear to contemporaries that a turning point had taken place here that was comparable to the discovery of America or the Industrial Revolution, perhaps even more profound. Newspapers spoke of the fire of Zeus, which man had stolen, and of the weapon of the end of the world. Some saw the bomb as a macabre guarantor of peace, as its unimaginable destructive power would make future wars impossible. Others warned that this new power could pave the way for even more dangerous conflicts. In fact, the decades that followed were to show that nuclear weapons did not bring an end to wars, but rather created a permanent threat that was referred to as the balance of terror. The atomic age is not only a history of politics, but also a history of thinking about man and the world. The philosopher Gunther Anders coined the term apocalypse blindness to describe how difficult it is for humanity to imagine the real destructive power of nuclear weapons. We can build atomic bombs, but we can hardly really imagine their consequences. This contradiction still shapes people's relationship to this technology today. The writer and later opponent of nuclear weapons Robert Junk spoke of a hell machine that not only destroys physically, but also shakes confidence in progress and science. Thus, the bomb is not only a technical artifact, but also a cultural symbol that has become deeply engraved in the collective consciousness. The fact that this story is so complex is also due to the fact that it touches on many dimensions. It is about scientific discoveries and the ethics of researchers who stood on the threshold between pure interest in knowledge and military use. It is about geopolitical rivalries in which nuclear weapons became central instruments of power. It is about social movements that rebelled against the nuclear threat and about states that continued to equip themselves with nuclear weapons despite international treaties. And it's about a global public sphere that has had to learn to live with the fact that a single push of a button could mean the end of civilization. The introduction to this story must therefore also show the area of tension in which nuclear weapons have always stood. On the one hand, they were seen as tools to end wars, as in the case of 1945, when the US used its bomb to force Japan to surrender. On the other hand, they became the ultimate symbol of terror that kept politics in a kind of permanent state of emergency. With the development of the hydrogen bomb in the 1950s, this field of tension multiplied once again. Humanity created weapons whose destructive power was so enormous that it exploded any comparison with earlier forms of violence. The existence of these weapons posed new moral questions not only for states, but also for humanity as a whole. Is it permissible to possess weapons that threaten the very basis of human existence? Is it possible to ever abolish them once they have been invented? At the same time, the history of nuclear weapons reveals a pattern that is typical of modernity. The belief in progress produces achievements that always have a downside. Just as the Industrial Revolution produced wealth, but also exploitation, environmental destruction, and social conflicts, nuclear physics brought not only energy production but also the potential for annihilation. In this sense, nuclear weapons are the most radical expression of the ambivalence that has accompanied modern technology since its beginnings. They are a reflection of the human ability to turn knowledge into power, but also of the inability to control that power. To understand this history, it is important not to look at nuclear weapons in isolation. They are not only a product of scientific curiosity or military necessity, but also an expression of the political constellations in which they emerged. Without the Second World War and the fear of Hitler's Germany, the Manhattan Project would hardly have been realized in this form. Without the Cold War and the rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union, the nuclear arms race might not have escalated to this extent. And without the global movements for peace and disarmament, the political pressure for disarmament negotiations would have been weaker. Nuclear weapons are therefore always embedded in larger historical processes that produced and were shaped by them at the same time. This introduction is intended to make it clear that the history of nuclear weapons is a history of extremes. It tells of the greatest scientific triumph and the greatest conceivable catastrophe. It is about visions of a world without war and the fear of total annihilation. It shows how people react in the face of the incomprehensible, with enthusiasm, with fear, with repression, or with resistance. In the following chapters, this arc of tension is unfolded step by step, from the early beginnings of nuclear physics to the Manhattan Project and the dropping of the first bombs to the geopolitical conflicts of the 21st century. It will become clear that the bomb is not only a historical phenomenon, but a highly topical topic to this day, a sword of Damocles that hovers over humanity. When we trace the history of nuclear weapons, we do so not only to understand the past, but also to classify the present and future. The threat of nuclear weapons is not an episode that ended with the end of the Cold War. Thousands of warheads are still stored in the arsenals of the nuclear powers, and new technologies such as hypersonic missiles or cyberattacks are changing the dynamics of nuclear deterrence. At the same time, there are international initiatives that keep the dream of a nuclear weapon-free world alive. Whether this dream can ever be realized is uncertain. The only thing that is certain is that since 1945 humanity has lived in a world in which the knowledge of the possibility of its self-destruction is indelible. This first chapter has set the scene. Nuclear weapons are more than just weapons. They are symbols, political instruments, cultural myths, and existential threats at the same time. In the coming chapters, we will see how they came into being, how they were used, how they determined the fate of states and people, and how they continue to shape our thinking about war and peace today. The history of nuclear weapons is the history of the fire of modernity, a fire that not only warms or shines, but has the power to devour everything. Chapter 2. The beginnings of nuclear physics. The history of nuclear weapons does not begin with the laboratories of Los Alamos or the chains of command of the Pentagon, but with a series of scientific discoveries that hardly anyone understood in their scope at the beginning of the 20th century. The foundations for what would later lead to the bomb were laid by physicists who were not concerned with military issues, but with the deepest secrets of nature. It was curiosity, the search for knowledge, that formed the starting point, and yet this curiosity was ultimately to lead to one of the most destructive applications in human history. In order to understand the later use of nuclear weapons, one must therefore go back to the origins of nuclear physics, to those decades in which radiation, radioactivity, and finally the fission of the atomic nucleus were discovered. The first was the discovery of X-rays in 1895 by Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen. He was experimenting with cathode ray tubes when he noticed that a fluorescent screen was starting to glow nearby, even though it was shielded by a cardboard wall. Röntgen had discovered invisible radiation that could penetrate solid bodies. The fascination was enormous, and soon people were talking about the X-ray age. Shortly afterwards, in 1896, Henri Becquerel made another groundbreaking observation. Certain uranium compounds could emit radiation on their own, without external influence. Radioactivity was thus discovered. Marie and Pierre Curie continued the research, isolating new elements such as polonium and radium, whose radiation attracted not only scientific but also medical and social attention. That these discoveries could one day lead to weapons was completely unimaginable at that time. There was talk of healing effects, of new diagnostic methods, and of a revolution in knowledge about nature. The dark sides remained hidden. In the first decades of the 20th century, physicists began to understand the atom no longer as an indivisible unit, but as a complex system. Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealand researcher, brought about a revolution in the atomic model in 1911 with his famous scattering experiment. He bombarded thin gold foils with alpha particles and found that some of these particles were strongly deflected. From this, he concluded that atoms must have a tiny, massive nucleus around which the electrons orbit. This core model was the first step towards a deeper understanding of the forces at work in the innermost part of matter. The discovery of the proton by Rutherford and the neutron by James Chadwick in 1932 finally completed the picture. The atomic nucleus consists of positively charged protons and uncharged neutrons, which are held together by the strong nuclear force. At the same time, quantum mechanics developed, which from the 1920s onwards enabled a completely new description of the world of the smallest. Physicists such as Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, and Erwin Schrödinger created theories that explained why electrons could not simply crash into the nucleus, but could take on stable orbits. Bohr's model was not only important for basic research, but later also became groundbreaking for nuclear physics. Hardly anyone suspected that this was the basis for a technology that could one day destroy entire cities. Science was initially a game with formulas, hypotheses, and experiments. The idea of military application was far away. The decisive step towards nuclear weapons came when researchers began not only to describe the atomic nucleus, but to actively change it. In 1934, the Italian Enrico Fermi experimented with the bombardment of uranium with neutrons. He hoped to create new, artificial elements. In fact, he discovered that neutron capture could set processes in motion that endangered the stability of the atomic nucleus. Fermi himself was initially unaware of the implications, but his work paved the way for the realization that atomic nuclei can be split. This discovery was finally made in December 1938 in Berlin. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann carried out experiments in which they bombarded uranium with neutrons and unexpectedly found the element barium as a fission product. The physical explanation was provided by Lise Meitner together with her nephew Otto Robert Frisch, both of whom had fled from the National Socialists. They realized that nuclear fission had taken place here. The atomic nucleus had broken into two parts, and enormous energy had been released in the process. This discovery marks the actual beginning of the atomic age. It was now clear that the binding energy in the atomic nucleus, which until then had only been known as a theoretical quantity, could be released in practice. Albert Einstein had already shown in 1905 in his famous formula E=mc² that mass can be converted into energy. Nuclear fission was proof that this conversion was not only possible, but also technically viable. In the laboratories of the 1930s, the idea of a bomb was still a long way off, but physicists like Leo Szilárd quickly realized that a process had been discovered that could make a chain reaction possible. A split uranium atom releases neutrons that split more uranium atoms, releasing more and more energy, potentially in an uncontrolled explosion. The political situation of the time gave these discoveries a whole new explosiveness. With the rise of Nazism in Germany and tensions in Europe, the question began to arise as to whether Hitler's regime might be able to use this new technology for military purposes. Many important physicists of Jewish origin had already fled Germany, including Albert Einstein, Leo Szilárd, Edward Teller, and others who found refuge in the United States. They were also the ones who formulated the first warnings. Szilárd in particular was convinced that a uranium bomb was possible in principle and that Germany could work on such a project. In a famous letter that Szilárd sent to President Roosevelt together with Einstein in 1939, the danger was pointed out and the necessity of American research was emphasized. This bridged the gap between pure science and politics, a step that was to change history forever. But before it got that far, it was scientific curiosity that remained the driving force. The 1920s and 1930s were a heyday of physics. Almost every month, new particles were discovered, new theories formulated, and new laboratory methods tested. The researchers moved in an international network, exchanged results, held congresses, and celebrated the power of the human mind to penetrate deeper and deeper into the mystery of matter. For many, it was an almost artistic experience. The beauty of the laws of nature, the elegance of mathematical formulas, the challenge of making the invisible visible. The fact that this beauty could grow into a deadly practice was a contradiction that only became dramatically apparent later. Looking back at these early decades, one recognizes a pattern that is typical of the development of science and technology. Discoveries are often made without looking at possible applications. They follow the urge for knowledge, for the understanding of what holds the world together at its core. Only later, when political or economic interests come into play, are they translated into concrete technologies. Nuclear physics is a particularly impressive example here. Within a few years, the study of exotic rays developed into a technology that changed the face of world politics. The beginnings of nuclear physics are therefore much more than a prehistory to nuclear weapons. They are a separate chapter in the history of science, characterized by genius, the joy of discovery, and a certain degree of innocence. The researchers of that time suspected that they were holding great things in their hands, but they could not foresee how much this knowledge would shake humanity. It was not until the political circumstances of the late 1930s that the knowledge of nuclear fission was the seed of the Manhattan Project. What began as a theoretical insight ended up as a warhead, and it is precisely in this transition that the tragedy, but also the fascination, of the history of nuclear weapons lies. Chapter 3. Between Science and Politics. The discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 was first and foremost a scientific milestone, but it soon became apparent that this new finding did not exist in a vacuum. She fell into the middle of a world marked by political instability, rising fascism, and the threat of war. The connection between science and politics has never before been so close, so explosive, and at the same time so momentous as it is at this time. What began in the laboratories of physicists such as Hahn, Meitner, and Fermi quickly became a question of national security, military superiority, and global power politics. Many of the most important physicists of their time moved in this field of tension, and they had to find answers to questions that went far beyond the realm of their scientific discipline. Especially in the United States, this connection quickly became apparent. Many European scientists who had fled National Socialism had settled there. Among them were central figures such as Albert Einstein, Leo Szilárd, Edward Teller, and Eugene Wiener. They all knew about the developments in European physics and suspected that Germany had the necessary scientific resources to start its own nuclear weapons program. For the exiles, the idea that Hitler could have a weapon that would wipe out entire cities was hardly bearable. The physical knowledge of nuclear fission thus turned into a political dilemma. Should a scientist draw the attention of states to the possibilities, even if this meant that he himself was involved in the development of such weapons? A central moment in this intertwining of science and politics was the famous Einstein-Szilárd Letter. In the summer of 1939, shortly before the outbreak of World War II, Leo Szilárd, together with Edward Teller and Eugene Weiner, drafted a letter to American President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In it, they warned urgently that Germany could possibly develop a nuclear bomb and suggested that the United States should urgently start its own research. Szilárd asked Albert Einstein to sign the letter, as his name carried considerable weight with political decision-makers. Einstein himself was actually a pacifist and was skeptical about the military use of scientific findings. But in view of the danger posed by Hitler, he agreed, even if he later regretted having been part of this process. Today, the letter is considered a key document of modern history because it established the direct link between theoretical physics and global political decision-making. Roosevelt reacted hesitantly at first, but soon afterwards the first investigations began, which finally led to the Manhattan Project. Science was thus faced with an ethical turning point. Never before had researchers been so directly confronted with the possibility that their work could lead to weapons of mass destruction. Many physicists tried not to imagine the consequences too much, others threw themselves into the new projects with great commitment. For her, it was a mixture of patriotic duty, scientific curiosity, and personal career opportunity. But there were also those who resisted or at least expressed concerns. Niels Bohr, one of the fathers of quantum mechanics, was convinced that nuclear weapons should not be developed in secret. He pleaded for international cooperation and for an open discussion about the dangers of this technology. Bohr saw the bomb as a global threat that could only be diffused through transparency and cooperation. However, his ideas met with little resonance, as the political reality was characterized by mistrust, secrecy, and military considerations. In Germany, the development was different. There, too, physicists such as Werner Heisenberg, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, and others were involved in nuclear research. The so-called uranium project was intended to clarify whether an atomic bomb or at least a nuclear reactor was possible. But the German program did not make any decisive progress. Whether this was due to a lack of scientific capacity, organizational weaknesses, or a lack of political pressure is still controversial today. Some suspect that Heisenberg deliberately exaggerated the difficulties in order to prevent Hitler from the bomb, others assume that the German physicists simply did not take the right paths. What is certain is that the National Socialist ideology and the expulsion of many Jewish scientists decisively weakened Germany. Ironically, it was precisely this flight that contributed to the United States becoming a center of nuclear research. The years around 1940 were marked by an increasing politicization of science. What had previously been international cooperation, physicists traveled freely to conferences, published in the same journals, shared their results, was now permeated by national interests. The Second World War cut the scientific networks in two. Researchers had to decide whether they wanted to share their findings with the Allies, the Axis powers, or no one at all. The idea of a supranational scientific community, as it had existed in the 1920s, collapsed under the pressure of political reality. In this phase, it became clear how dependent the development of technology is on the framework conditions of world politics. For many researchers, this meant an inner conflict. The fascination that nuclear physics exerted was unbroken. The prospect of finally not only understanding the secrets of the atomic nucleus, but also using them in practice, was irresistible for many. But the connection of this work with the war was a burden. Szilárd, for example, was convinced that it was necessary to preempt Hitler, but he also feared the consequences once the bomb was built. Many scientists who later worked on the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos consoled themselves with the idea that they could shorten the war and save lives. It was only after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that many became aware that they had become part of a new era of annihilation. The relationship between science and politics was thus characterized by interdependence in this phase. Politics needed science to be technologically superior in war, and science needed politics to get its projects financed and organized. Never before had such sums flowed into a research project as into the Manhattan Project. The scientists were given resources that would have seemed unimaginable to them in peacetime. But this support was also accompanied by a loss of control. The results of their work no longer belonged to them, but were put at the service of state interests. The dream of independent research gave way to the reality of military purpose limitation. In retrospect, it is clear that this period marked the beginning of a new role for science. It was no longer just a field of knowledge, but became a strategic factor in world politics. The physicists were no longer just researchers, but actors on a stage that decided on war and peace. Some, like Oppenheimer, consciously accepted this role and saw themselves as mediators between politics and science. Others, like Boe, tried to think against the logic of secrecy and armaments. Still others tried to suppress their responsibility. Together, however, they stood at a point where their discipline had irrevocably become part of political history. The combination of science and politics in the years before the Manhattan Project was therefore not a coincidence, but the result of a world in upheaval. The threat of fascism, the pressures of war, and the unimagined power of nuclear fission made a separation between the laboratory and the government impossible. This laid the foundation for a new era in which scientific findings were always evaluated according to their military usefulness. This development was to shape the entire 20th century and fundamentally change the role of science in society. Chapter 4: The Manhattan Project. When the United States was at war with Japan at the end of 1941 after the attack on Pearl Harbor and a little later also with Germany and Italy, the idea of an atomic bomb was no longer just theoretical speculation. What had previously been outlined in letters by exiled scholars such as Leo Szilárd or in reflections by Niels Bohr and Enrico Fermi now took concrete shape. Scattered research programs became a gigantic project, the largest scientific and technical project of its time, the Manhattan Project. It was an operation of unprecedented proportions, an interplay of secrecy, science, industry, and the military, which would eventually lead within a few years to the weapon that ended World War II and ushered in a new era in world history. The name Manhattan Project was rather inconspicuous. Originally, it referred to the office of the Army Corps of Engineers in Manhattan, which oversaw the first organizational steps. But behind this sober designation was an undertaking that would soon extend across the entire American continent. Over the years, more than 130,000 people worked in factories, laboratories, and on heavily guarded construction sites, without most of them knowing what they were actually involved in. It was a project of unprecedented dimensions. It cost over $2 billion by 1945, which would be many times higher in today's purchasing power. The project was led by General Leslie R. Groves, an officer in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who had already demonstrated his skills as an organizer during the construction of the Pentagon. Groves was not a scientist, but a man of practice, assertive, disciplined, and with a penchant for control. He was assisted by Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist from Berkeley, who was recruited as scientific director. Oppenheimer was a brilliant, if not outstanding researcher until then, but he had the rare ability to coordinate and inspire different personalities. Under his leadership, the Los Alamos laboratory, the heart of bomb development, was built in the New Mexico desert. But before the bomb could even be designed, huge technical hurdles had to be overcome. The crucial raw material was uranium-235, an isotope that was difficult to separate from the much more common uranium-238. Alternatively, plutonium could be used, an artificial element that had to be extracted in nuclear reactors. Both paths were uncharted territory. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, an entire city was built that was used exclusively to enrich uranium with huge plants. Various methods were tried: electromagnetic separation, gas diffusion, centrifuges, and all of them required machines that had never been built before. At the same time, reactors were being built in Hanford, Washington, which produced plutonium. Here, too, the engineers broke new ground. Never before had anyone operated a plant that produced fissile material on an industrial scale. This industrial side of the project was just as crucial as the scientific side. Because without enough fissile material, no bomb could be built. While tens of thousands of workers in Oak Ridge and Hanford toiled day and night, scientists in Los Alamos worked on the construction principles. There were two basic types: a bomb that worked with a cannon principle, in which two pieces of uranium were shot at each other and thus combined to form a critical mass, and a more complicated implosion bomb, in which a plutonium ball had to be evenly compressed with conventional explosives. The first type was later named Little Boy, the second Fat Man. The work at Los Alamos was a peculiar mix of academic freedom and military rigor. Oppenheimer managed to gather some of the best minds in physics: Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, Edward Teller, John von Neumann, and many others. They lived with their families in a remote small town in the desert, sealed off from the outside world, but with an intensity that many later described as unforgettable. At the same time, absolute secrecy prevailed. Letters were censored, visitors were strictly controlled, and even among the scientists, one often did not know what the other was working on. The entire project was permeated by the fear that information could leak out, be it to the press or spies. This fear was not unfounded. The Soviet Secret Service actually had several informants in Los Alamos, including Klaus Fuchs, who later passed on essential information to Moscow. The moral questions associated with this project were often discussed during the long working nights, but rarely thought through consistently. Many physicists were convinced that Germany had to be preempted. The idea of a Nazi atomic bomb was a nightmare for most people, which had to be prevented at all costs. But when it became clear in 1944 that the German nuclear program was far below expectations, a new question arose: should the bomb still be built at all? For the military leadership and politicians, the answer was clear. The US was at war with Japan, and a weapon that could end that war quickly was invaluable. For the scientists, the answer was more complicated. Some, like Teller, saw the development as a scientific challenge and were already thinking about even bigger weapons. Others, like Szilárd, tried to exert influence with petitions and demanded a demonstration of the bomb instead of its use against cities. But in the end, it was not they, but the political decision-makers who determined the path the bomb would take. The decisive moment of the Manhattan Project came on July 16, 1945 in the New Mexico desert. The first atomic bomb was detonated at a test site near Alamogordo, the Trinity test. It was a plutonium implosion bomb, so it was the same type as Fat Man. The explosion exceeded all expectations. A dazzling flash of light, brighter than the sun, lit up the desert, a gigantic cloud rose, and the blast wave could still be felt in the distance. Oppenheimer later recalled that verses from the Bhagavad Gita went through his head: "Now I have become death, the destroyer of the worlds." At that moment, the theoretical possibility had become reality. Humanity had created a new weapon that eclipsed everything that had come before. The news of Trinity was kept top secret, but the White House waited anxiously. President Harry S. Truman, who took office in April 1945 after Roosevelt's death, received the report during the Potsdam Conference, where the future of Europe after the war was negotiated. For him, the bomb was not only a military tool, but also a political instrument. It gave the US an unprecedented position of power vis-à-vis Japan, and also vis-à-vis the Soviet Union, which was an ally but was increasingly seen as a future rival. From the very beginning, the use of the bomb was thus not only a decision about the end of the war, but also a signal to the world about the new order of power. The Manhattan Project had accomplished in just 3 years what had previously seemed unimaginable. The abstract discovery of nuclear fission had become a real, functioning weapon. But the project had also left its mark, a new kind of science that was closely intertwined with the state and the military, a vast infrastructure that forever blurred the separation between research and armaments, and a community of scientists who lived with the burden of having opened the door to the atomic era. The bomb was now a reality, and the world was never to be the same again. Chapter 5: The Los Alamos Bomb. Los Alamos, an inconspicuous plateau in the New Mexico desert, became one of the most mysterious places in the world during World War II. Here, sealed off from civilization, under strict surveillance and surrounded by desert landscape, the first nuclear weapons in human history were created. Under the direction of Robert Oppenheimer and as part of the gigantic Manhattan Project, an international team of physicists, chemists, engineers, and military personnel developed the 2 bombs that were to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the summer of 1945. The bomb of Los Alamos is not only a technical masterpiece, but also a symbol of the moment when scientific knowledge was finally transformed into a tool of destruction. The laboratory in Los Alamos was by no means a cozy university institute, but a strictly shielded small town with thousands of inhabitants. The scientists lived there with their families. Children played between barracks while their parents worked on experiments whose goal they often only guessed at. Everything was under the strictest secrecy. Letters were censored, telephone calls were monitored, visits were controlled. Many of the scientists found this isolation oppressive. Others spoke of a unique intensity that resulted from the concentration of so many brilliant minds in one place. It was a place of extremes, scientific flights of fancy and existential doubt, technical creativity, and moral conflicts. The main task of Los Alamos was to construct actual functioning weapons from the fissile material produced at Oak Ridge and Hanford. From the very beginning, the focus was on 2 concepts. The first variant was the uranium bomb, later called Little Boy. It was based on the comparatively simple principle of shooting 2 subcritical masses of uranium-235 at each other with conventional explosives so quickly that they formed a critical mass and triggered an uncontrolled chain reaction. This cannon principle was uncomplicated in theory and did not require too complex technology, but had a decisive disadvantage. It was only possible with highly enriched uranium, the extraction of which was extremely complex and expensive. The second variant was the plutonium bomb, later called Fat Man. Plutonium could be produced in reactors, so it was in principle more readily available than uranium-235, but its physical properties made the cannon principle unusable. Even small amounts of plutonium-240, which was unavoidably produced during production, meant that the chain reaction could ignite too early. Therefore, a more complicated procedure had to be developed: the implosion. In this process, a sphere of plutonium was compressed from all sides simultaneously with a symmetrical system of conventional explosive charges, so that it reached the supercritical state within fractions of a millionth of a second. This technique was revolutionary, but also risky, because it required a precision that was hardly imaginable at the time. The problem of implosion occupied the scientists of Los Alamos for years. Explosives had to be arranged in such a way that they detonated in perfect time and created a uniform pressure wave. Even the smallest deviations would have caused the bomb to fail. Mathematicians such as John von Neumann developed complex models, engineers continued to test new ignition systems, and hundreds of test explosions with conventional explosives were carried out to perfect the technology. The effort was enormous, but in the end it was possible to develop a functional implosion construction. The completion of the two weapons meant that the decision on their use now passed into the hands of politicians. President Harry S. Truman and his team of advisors were faced with a historic choice. Should the bomb actually be used, and if so, how? For the scientists in Los Alamos, this was a moment of great tension. Some hoped the bomb would only serve as a threat, others feared that it would inevitably be used against Japan. Szilárd and some comrades in arms wrote petitions proposing a demonstration in uninhabited territory to persuade Japan to surrender without killing civilians. But these voices were hardly heard in the political decision-making process. The bombs of Los Alamos were therefore more than just technical objects. They were the embodiment of a new power that was to change forever the relationship between war and peace, between science and politics. The men and women involved in its development were at a turning point in history. They had shown that the human mind and technical creativity were capable of unleashing the forces of the universe. But they also had to recognize that these forces were not under their control, but were directed by political and military institutions. After the war, Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project became myths. The sight of the bomb symbolized the triumph of science, but also its abyss. The images of the destroyed cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stood in sharp contrast to the enthusiastic reports of technical successes and elegant mathematical solutions. Oppenheimer himself expressed this dichotomy when he said after the war that scientists had known sin. Los Alamos was not only a laboratory of physics, but also a laboratory of morality, in which it became clear that science never exists independently of the consequences of its applications. Chapter 6: Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a dazzling flash of light rose over the Japanese city of Hiroshima, brighter than anything humans had ever seen before. Within seconds, a bustling city turned into an inferno. The atomic bomb Little Boy, dropped from the American B-29 Enola Gay, detonated at an altitude of about 600 meters above the city center. It was the first military use of a nuclear weapon in history, and it marked the beginning of a new era. What had been devised in the laboratories of Los Alamos now showed its unimaginable destructive power in real war. Hiroshima, a city of over 300,000 people, was largely wiped out in a few moments. Tens of thousands of people died instantly, and countless others succumbed to their injuries and radiation sickness in the days and weeks that followed. The bomb that exploded over Hiroshima was a uranium projectile designed according to the so-called cannon principle. Two pieces of uranium-235 were merged in fractions of a second, creating a critical mass and starting a chain reaction. The energy released corresponded to about 15,000 tons of TNT. The blast wave destroyed almost all buildings within a radius of 2 kilometers, and the heat ignited immediate fires that combined to form a gigantic firestorm. People who were within a radius of a few hundred meters literally evaporated. Further away, they suffered burns that exposed the flesh to the bone. Many did not die immediately, but dragged themselves through the burning city in search of water, rescue, or relatives, a picture that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. The immediate number of victims of Hiroshima is estimated at about 70,000 to 80,000 people, but by the end of 1945 it had risen to over 140,000, as many died from the late effects of their injuries. The radiation wreaked havoc on the human body, causing leukemia, cancer, and other diseases that often did not become apparent until years later. Entire families were wiped out, generations traumatized, and the city, which had once been a thriving trading and garrison town, became synonymous with destruction and suffering. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, a similar tragedy occurred in Nagasaki. The second bomb, Fat Man, a plutonium implosion bomb, was originally dropped on the city of Kokura. But poor visibility forced the pilots to switch to the alternative destination of Nagasaki. The bomb also detonated at an altitude of several hundred meters and released an explosive force of about 21,000 tons of TNT. The topography of Nagasaki, nestled between hills, prevented the destruction from being as uniform as in Hiroshima, but the consequences were still catastrophic. Around 40,000 people died immediately, and by the end of 1945 the death toll was around 70,000. Here, too, the city was transformed into a landscape of ruins, and here, too, the survivors, the hibakusha, suffered from physical and mental consequences for decades. Many of them had to experience how they were stigmatized because other people considered radiation sickness to be contagious. The stories of the survivors, their descriptions of burned children, of people wandering through the streets with shreds of skin on their arms, of watercourses full of corpses, are among the most haunting testimonies of the 20th century. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not only historical dates, they are ciphers for the absolute limit of human destructive power. The decision to use the atomic bomb was controversial from the beginning. President Harry S. Truman and his advisors argued that the airdrop was necessary to end the war quickly and avoid an invasion of Japan that would have cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. Japan had not yet surrendered despite the difficult military situation, and the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa had shown how doggedly the Japanese army could resist. In this logic, the use of the bomb appeared to be the lesser evil that would save human lives in total. But there were also other voices. Some military officials, including General Dwight D. Eisenhower, considered the mission unnecessary because Japan was already on the verge of defeat. Some scientists, such as Szilárd and his comrades in arms, had hoped that the bomb could be displayed in an uninhabited area in order to persuade the Japanese leadership to give up without killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Others saw the bombings less as a military necessity than as a political signal to the Soviet Union, which was seen as a future rival after the war. The historical debate about whether Hiroshima and Nagasaki were really inevitable is still going on today. Regardless of the justification, the effect was immediate. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito declared the surrender of Japan in a historic radio address. For millions of Japanese listeners, it was the first time they heard the voice of their emperor. The Second World War was thus officially over. The atomic bomb had unfolded its horror and led history into a new chapter. The two missions also had an immense psychological effect on the world public. Newspapers reported on a superweapon that could destroy a city with a single blow. Many people reacted with fascination, others with fear. The Soviet Union took the news as a signal that it had to develop a bomb itself in order not to fall into permanent inferiority. This marked the beginning of the arms race that characterized the Cold War. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not only the end of a war, but also the prelude to a new global conflict. For the people in the two cities, on the other hand, a decades-long struggle for survival and recognition began. The survivors suffered not only from illness, but also from discrimination. Many could not find work or spouse because they feared that they would be permanently damaged. It was not until the 1950s and 1960s that the Japanese government and international organizations began to launch medical programs to systematically study the consequences. This research laid the foundation for our current knowledge of radiation sickness, cancer risks, and genetic damage. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became places of remembrance in the decades that followed. Memorials, museums, and peace parks were built, and every year on the 6th and the 9th of August, people gathered to commemorate the victims. The suffering of the Hibakusha also gave rise to an international peace movement that pursued the goal of never allowing the use of nuclear weapons again. The voices of the survivors became a moral appeal to the international community to learn the lessons of the horrors of 1945. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains a key moment in human history to this day. It shows with drastic clarity what happens when scientific knowledge is put at the service of total annihilation. It marked the end of the Second World War, but at the same time the beginning of a constant threat from nuclear weapons that has not been banished to this day. And it confronts us with a question that remains unanswered even after decades. Was it necessary to use these weapons, or was it a crime that cannot be justified by anything? Either way, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are more than historical events. They are symbols, admonitions, and reminders that man has the power to destroy himself, and that it is his responsibility to control this power. Chapter 7. The World After 1945. August 15, 1945 marked the official end of the Second World War. Millions of people celebrated the end of a global catastrophe that had claimed over 60 million victims. But in the shadows of this joy lay something new, something monstrous. The world had learned in a matter of days that a single bomb could destroy a city, that people could evaporate in seconds, that entire landscapes could be submerged in firestorms, and that invisible rays could cause long-term illness. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not only the end of a war, they were also the beginning of a new epoch that was soon to be called the nuclear age. The first reactions after 1945 fluctuated between triumph and horror. In the United States, many newspapers celebrated the bomb as a miracle weapon that had ended the war and saved the lives of countless American soldiers. Cartoons showed Japan as a submissive victim of the nuclear hammer, and President Truman defended the decision by pointing out that it was the only possible one. In Japan, on the other hand, there was shock and bewilderment. The emperor himself spoke of a new and cruel instrument that had made the continuation of the war impossible. The survivors, the Hibakusha, had to find their way through the ruins of their cities, while many of them suffered from severe burns, radiation sickness, and psychological trauma. Internationally, the news of the use of the atomic bomb triggered both admiration and fear. For many observers, it was the ultimate proof of the superiority of the United States, which now stood as the undisputed superpower. But at the same time, a worldwide reflection on the consequences began. Newspapers and intellectuals spoke of the beginning of a new era and warned that humanity was now in a position to extinguish itself. The French writer Albert Camus wrote that humanity is faced with the choice of surviving together or perishing together. Such voices made it clear that the use of the bomb was far more than a military episode. It was a turning point in thinking about war, peace, and the role of technology. At the institutional level, the first reaction was the founding of the United Nations. As early as 1945, the UN came into being as a new platform for international cooperation, driven by the hope of preventing future wars. Nuclear weapons have played a central role in UN debates from the very beginning. As early as January 1946, the Atomic Energy Commission was set up to advise on the international control of nuclear technology. The American Baruch Plan proposed placing all nuclear weapons under UN control and at the same time establishing a worldwide ban on further national programs. But the Soviet Union refused. Mistrust and the looming confrontation between the former allies prevented an agreement. Thus, the dream of international control of nuclear weapons remained unfulfilled, and the Cold War began before it was officially called that. The world after 1945 was characterized by this mistrust. While the United States initially had a monopoly on the bomb, for all observers it was only a matter of time before other states would follow. In Moscow, Soviet physicists, supported by espionage information from Los Alamos, were working feverishly on their own project. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, and the balance of power shifted dramatically. But even in the immediate post-war years, the atmosphere was one of uncertainty. Would the US use its new weapon to achieve political goals? Could a new war break out, this time not with tanks and planes, but with a single devastating weapon? For the societies of the world, a new phase of confrontation with war and peace began. In Japan, a strong peace movement grew, which took the suffering of the Hibakusha as its starting point. In the USA, on the other hand, a phase of pride initially set in, which was accompanied by a wave of popular scientific reports. Books, films, and magazines explained the secrets of the atom to the public. At the same time, a commercial narrative began that presented nuclear power as a source of unlimited energy and prosperity. Atoms for peace became a slogan that reflected both hopes for peaceful use and the fear of military escalation. The cultural processing of the use of the atomic bomb took many forms. In literature, novels and poems were written that addressed the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Films such as Hiroshima Mon Amour or The Cloud took up the traumatic experiences. The visual arts also reacted with haunting depictions of destruction. At the same time, a genre of its own developed in the United States, that of nuclear optimism. Comics, commercials, and science fiction films presented nuclear energy as the key to a glorious future: flying cars, unlimited electricity, cures for diseases. This ambivalence between horror and hope shaped the post-war period to a particular degree. Politically, the situation was exacerbated by the incipient rivalry between the USA and the Soviet Union. Even in the first post-war years, it became clear that the two superpowers would not live in a stable partnership. The division of Germany, the conflict over Eastern Europe, and the ideological antagonisms led to a climate of confrontation. In this context, nuclear weapons became symbols of power. The USA demonstrated its superiority. The Soviets worked at full speed to catch up. The mission of 1945 was therefore not only a military end to the Second World War, but also the prelude to a new form of international politics: nuclear deterrence. While the major powers positioned themselves, many smaller states were faced with the question of their own role. Should one try to develop nuclear weapons oneself in order not to be blackmailed? Or should one seek renunciation and place oneself under the protection of a great power? These questions began to determine the foreign policy of many countries, even if the technical possibilities were still limited. The atomic bomb was not just a weapon, it was a political instrument that shifted the balance of power of the entire world order. The consequences of the new reality were also evident in people's everyday lives. In the United States, civil defense exercises were introduced as early as the late 1940s. Schools rehearsed with children how they should hide under desks to protect themselves from an explosion. Brochures explained how cellars could be converted into shelters. In Japan, on the other hand, people lived with the real long-term effects: malformations in newborns, rising cancer rates, trauma in the survivors. Two completely different societal experiences reflected the same global threat. The world after 1945 was thus a world in upheaval. On the one hand, humanity had left behind one of its greatest catastrophes, and there was hope for a more peaceful future. On the other hand, nuclear weapons had created a new threat that had the potential to surpass all previous forms of violence. States, societies, and individuals had to learn to live with this ambivalence: the joy of peace and the fear of total annihilation. In retrospect, the year 1945 seems like a fork in the road. Humanity could have decided to see the bomb as a one-time warning and decide to ban it. But instead, it became the central instrument of power politics. The hope of the peace movements that Hiroshima and Nagasaki would remain the last atomic bombings in history was not fulfilled. Rather, a race began that was to determine the next decades. The world after 1945 was thus a world of paradoxes, a world of peace shaped by the memory of war, a world of scientific progress that at the same time feared its own destructive power, and a world of new international cooperation that was at the same time torn apart by growing mistrust. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were in the collective memory as a warning, but they also became the starting point of a policy that calculated with horror. This contradictory constellation gave rise to the balance of terror that was to determine the second half of the 20th century. Chapter 8. The Cold War begins. When the guns of the Second World War had fallen silent, a new confrontation immediately began, which was no longer only about territories, raw materials, or colonies, but about the survival of humanity itself. The Cold War was not simply a succession dispute between the victorious powers, it was a global systemic conflict in which two worldviews were irreconcilably opposed to each other: liberal democracy under the leadership of the United States and communism under the leadership of the Soviet Union. In this ideological and geopolitical competition, nuclear weapons have played a central role from the very beginning. They were symbol, threatening, and power factor at the same time. In Moscow, the message of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been understood with sharpness. Joseph Stalin officially congratulated the Americans, but immediately had his scientists tell him how close they themselves were to the development. The Soviet Secret Service had already received valuable information from spies in Los Alamos, especially from Klaus Fuchs. With this knowledge, the Soviet Union was able to accelerate its own nuclear program. In 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima, it detonated its first atomic bomb. With this, the monopoly of the USA was broken, and the world entered a new phase, the nuclear arms race. The existence of two nuclear superpowers fundamentally changed the logic of international politics. Until then, wars had been decided by conventional armies, by tanks, ships, planes. Now a single order was enough to wipe out millions of lives. This new situation led to a concept that was soon on everyone's lips: deterrence. The theory was that no one would use a nuclear weapon as long as they had to expect to be destroyed by a counterstrike. This balance of terror became the foundation of strategic considerations during the Cold War. But before this fragile balance stabilized, the atmosphere was one of fear and uncertainty. In the late 1940s, a veritable nuclear culture emerged in the USA. Civil defense exercises in schools taught children to duck under the tables in the event of an attack. Brochures explained to families how to stock up or how to turn cellars into shelters. Films and comics painted scenarios of nuclear attacks. The bomb was not only a military instrument, it also shaped everyday life and the collective psyche. In the Soviet Union, the public image was less visible, but even their planning for emergencies began, and propaganda portrayed the American operation of 1945 as proof of the cruelty of capitalism. Politically, the situation quickly worsened. With the Truman Doctrine of 1947, the United States declared that it would stand by any country threatened by communist influence. The Marshall Plan pumped billions into the reconstruction of Western Europe, while the Soviet Union installed its satellite states in Eastern Europe. Berlin became the focal point of this confrontation, and during the blockade of 1948-49, the world was on the brink of a direct clash for the first time. The fact that there was no war was also due to the nuclear background. The existence of the bomb acted like an invisible factor that slowed down both sides. However, the Soviet bomb of 1949 immediately began a new round of the arms race. In the United States, many politicians and military officials pushed to develop an even more powerful weapon: the hydrogen bomb. President Truman gave the green light in 1950, and just a few years later the United States tested the first thermonuclear bomb, whose explosive power exceeded that of Hiroshima many times over. The Soviets soon followed suit. This shifted the nuclear balance again, and the logic of deterrence became even more sinister. Not only cities, but entire countries could be wiped out in a matter of minutes. The 1950s were marked by this escalation. Every step of one side evoked an answer from the other. New bomber fleets, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-based systems, all of this was created during this time. For the population, it meant a permanent life in the shadow of the possible. The Cold War was not just a political dispute, but a psychological state, the feeling that the world could go up in flames at any time in a matter of minutes. At the same time, there were always moments when it became clear how close the world was to the catastrophe. The Korean crisis of 1950 to 1953 was such a moment. When North Korea invaded the South and the United States intervened, the question arose as to whether nuclear weapons would be used. General Douglas MacArthur openly pushed for the deployment, but was whistled back by Truman. Even if it didn't happen, this debate showed how real the possibility was. The bomb was no longer just a symbol, it was an option on the strategic board. On both sides, considerations about the political use of the bomb also began. For the United States, it was a means of securing its leading role in the Western alliance. For the Soviet Union, it was proof that it was on an equal footing with the United States. So both systems also used the bomb for propaganda. In films, parades and speeches, it became a symbol of national strength. But behind the facade, fear remained. Everyone knew that a single mistake, a misunderstanding, or a technical defect could be enough to bring about the downfall. Science played a double role in this phase. On the one hand, physicists and engineers worked feverishly on ever-new improvements to the weapons. On the other hand, the unease of many scientists grew, remembering that they had originally developed the bomb to preempt Hitler. Now they saw that their invention had become part of a global power game. Voices such as those of Albert Einstein or Bertrand Russell urgently warned against self-destruction. The Russell-Einstein Declaration of 1955 called for finding new ways of resolving conflicts before it was too late. So the world after 1945 had not entered into a stable peace, but into a new, invisible war. This Cold War was different from all previous conflicts. It was not decided by battles, but by the threat of total annihilation. Nuclear weapons became the central factor in world politics, and they created a paradoxical situation. Precisely because they were so terrible, they prevented direct war between the superpowers. But this fragile balance also meant that humanity was constantly on the brink of the abyss. If you look at the beginnings of the Cold War, you can see the contours of an age that would remain formative for decades. An age of fear, of race, of ideological fronts, but also of cautious steps towards arms control. There was still no solution in sight, and the arms race still dominated. But even at this early stage, it became clear that nuclear weapons were not only military instruments, but also unleashed political, cultural, and psychological forces that reshaped the world order. Chapter 9: Hydrogen Bomb and the Era of Superweapons. When the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, it deeply shook the United States' sense of power. The American monopoly was broken, and suddenly the world no longer seemed to be determined by the undisputed dominance of one nation, but by a dangerous equilibrium. In Washington, the search for new technological advantage immediately began. The solution was to lie in a weapon whose destructive power exceeded the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki many times over. The hydrogen bomb, also known as the H-bomb. It marked the beginning of the era of superweapons, a time in which the physical limits of what was possible were pushed further and further as humanity learned to live with the fear of its own demise. The hydrogen bomb differs from the atomic bomb in one crucial point. While the bombs of 1945 were based on nuclear fission, i.e. the tearing apart of heavy atomic nuclei such as uranium or plutonium, the H-bomb used nuclear fusion, the same process that powers the sun. At extremely high temperatures, light atomic nuclei such as deuterium and tritium fuse to form heavier nuclei, releasing even more energy than during fission. The idea of harnessing this massive source of energy for a bomb had already been discussed during the Manhattan Project, but the technical difficulties seemed insurmountable. Edward Teller, a Hungarian-American physicist, had already promoted the development of a super in Los Alamos, but at that time it remained theoretical considerations. After 1949, the situation changed. President Harry S. Truman decided in early 1950 to press ahead with work on the hydrogen bomb with all his might. The decision was not without controversy. Many scientists, including Robert Oppenheimer, expressed concerns. They feared that an even more powerful bomb would only accelerate the spiral of the arms race. But in the atmosphere of the early Cold War, in which the Korean War and Soviet expansion dominated the headlines, the proponents prevailed. Edward Teller became the driving force, supported by the Polish mathematician Stanislaw Ulam, who eventually developed the decisive concept, the so-called Teller-Ulam design. This design was based on a two-stage construction. An atomic bomb acted as a detonator, generating the extreme temperatures and pressures necessary to set the fusion in motion in a second explosive device. This was the birth of the H-bomb, a weapon whose explosive power was no longer measured in kilotons, but in megatons. While Hiroshima had experienced an explosion of about 15,000 tons of TNT, a single hydrogen bomb could release several million tons of TNT. The dimensions were so gigantic that one could hardly speak of weapons in the classical sense. They were apocalypses in miniature. On November 1, 1952, the US tested its first hydrogen bomb on the Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific. The test was codenamed Ivy Mike. The explosion was of a force that surpassed anything that had been seen before. The bomb completely transformed the small island of Aleugelab into a crater almost 2 kilometers in diameter. The fireball cloud rose over 40 kilometers high into the atmosphere, and the blast wave was felt even hundreds of kilometers away. Scientists who observed the event were both fascinated and horrified. They had proven that fusion could be unleashed on Earth, and that humans now possessed a weapon that made it possible to destroy not only one city, but entire countries. But the United States was not to retain its monopoly on this new weapon for long. As early as 1953, the Soviet Union tested its own version of a hydrogen bomb. With this, the arms race had finally entered a new dimension. The rivalry of the superpowers was no longer expressed only in the number of warheads, but also in their size and destructive power. Soon new tests followed, in which the limits of what was feasible were explored. Finally, in 1961, the Soviet Union detonated the Tsar bomb, the most powerful nuclear weapon ever built. With an explosive force of around 50 megatons of TNT, it generated a pressure wave that circled the Earth several times and a cloud that reached into the stratosphere. Originally, the bomb was designed for 100 megatons, but even the Soviet scientists considered it too dangerous. Even in this weakened form, the Tsar bomb was a symbol that the arms race had crossed every reasonable limit. However, the era of superweapons was marked not only by the number of tests, but also by their psychological effect. In both superpowers, entire generations lived with the fear that a nuclear war could break out at any time. The hydrogen bomb made it clear that such a war would claim not only millions, but hundreds of millions of victims. Cities, countries, and possibly the entire human civilization were at stake. The concept of mutually assured destruction became the cynical basis of international politics in the 1960s. It said that an attack was pointless, as it would inevitably lead to one's own demise. This logic was paradoxical. On the one hand, it actually prevented the superpowers from waging war directly against each other. On the other hand, it meant that humanity was constantly living on the brink of extinction. Misunderstandings, false alarms, or technical defects could trigger the outbreak of a nuclear war, even without anyone really wanting it. The fact that the world narrowly avoided such scenarios several times in the 1950s and 1960s shows how dangerous this era was. For the scientists, the development of superweapons was a moral acid test. Many of those who had worked in the Manhattan Project felt alienated when they saw their work lead to increasingly monstrous weapons. Oppenheimer himself came under political pressure in the 1950s because he had spoken out against Teller and the unchecked expansion of the hydrogen bomb. In a notorious hearing, he was stripped of his security clearance and effectively excluded from the political decision-making process. Teller, on the other hand, the father of the H-bomb, rose to become one of the most influential physicists of his time, even if many of his colleagues avoided him because they held him responsible for the betrayal of Oppenheimer. The social reaction to the era of superweapons was multi-layered. In the USA and Europe, peace movements arose to protest against nuclear tests and the permanent threat. Scientists founded organizations such as the Pugwash conferences that looked for ways to slow down the arms race. At the same time, governments used fear as a political tool. In the USA, buzzwords such as duck and cover shaped everyday life, while in the Soviet Union, propaganda celebrated the strength of one's own weapons. International diplomacy also had to reinvent itself. As early as the 1950s, the first agreements were discussed to limit the excesses of the arms race. In 1963, the Test Ban Agreement was finally concluded, which prohibited above-ground tests. But by then, the superpowers had detonated hundreds of explosions in the atmosphere, with devastating consequences for the environment and health. Radioactive fallout spread across the globe, and for the first time humanity was confronted with the realization that nuclear weapons posed a global danger not only in war, but also during their testing. The hydrogen bomb and the era of superweapons are symbolic of the hubris of the Cold War. They show how far people were willing to go to assert power and security, even if the price was potentially their own destruction. At the same time, they made clear the limits of politics. No nation, no matter how powerful, could decouple itself from the threat. Everyone was equally vulnerable. When you look back on this time today, it seems like a permanent dance on the abyss. The hydrogen bomb was not simply a further development of the atomic bomb, it was a leap into a new dimension of violence. It marked the beginning of an age in which humanity had made its own extinction technically feasible. The fact that there was never a global nuclear war despite all the crises is perhaps due less to the wisdom of politicians than to chance, the reason of individual actors and luck. The era of superweapons has shaped the world like hardly any other chapter of the 20th century, and its shadows reach into the present. Chapter 10. Atomic bomb tests worldwide. The development of the atomic and hydrogen bombs would not have been conceivable without a series of tests. From the first attempts in the New Mexico desert to the gigantic explosions on Pacific atolls and in the Siberian steppes, nuclear weapons tests accompanied the entire Cold War. They were technical necessity, political signal, and psychological spectacle at the same time. Each bomb detonated served to check the functionality of new designs, to expand the arsenal and to demonstrate one's own strength to the enemy. But the consequences of these tests went far beyond the military dimension. They altered landscapes, poisoned soil and water, released radioactive fallout, and shaped the lives of hundreds of thousands of people living near the test sites. The first atomic bomb test took place on July 16, 1945 in the New Mexico desert. Trinity was the start of an era in which hundreds of explosions shook the Earth. Soon after, the United States used Pacific islands such as Bikini and Eniwetok as a testing ground. There, entire islands were turned into craters, and the population had to be forcibly resettled. The Castle Bravo explosion of 1954, in which the USA tested its first hydrogen-based bomb with dry fuel, became particularly notorious. The explosion was twice as powerful as planned, and the released radioactivity contaminated large parts of the Pacific. Fishermen who were in the vicinity fell seriously ill, and the inhabitants of the Marshall Islands are still suffering from the health consequences today. Castle Bravo impressively showed the world that nuclear tests could not only be technical experiments, but global environmental catastrophes. The Soviet Union also operated a massive test program since 1949. Their central test site was located near Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan. Hundreds of explosions were carried out there, many of them above ground. The steppe turned into a radioactive desert, and the local population was exposed to the consequences for decades. Lack of security measures, secrecy, and lack of medical care led to generations of Kazakhs suffering from cancer, genetic damage, and psychological stress. Later, the site would become a symbol of the destructive consequences of nuclear tests, when activists demanded its closure in the 1980s. France and Great Britain joined the circle of nuclear powers in the 1950s and 1960s and conducted their own test series. The British chose remote areas in Australia and later the Pacific. Decades later, Australian Aborigines and veterans of the British Army complained of health problems. France first tested in the Algerian desert and, after Algeria's independence, in French Polynesia. There, atolls such as Mururoa and Fangatorfa became the scene of powerful explosions. The images of huge mushroom clouds over tropical islands imprinted themselves on the collective memory. For many Polynesians, however, the tests meant displacement, contamination, and a massive burden on their environment. It was not until the 1990s that French tests were finally discontinued. China joined the circle of nuclear powers in 1964 and conducted its tests at the Lop Nor test site in Xinjiang. There, too, the local population was exposed to the consequences of radiation, and many reports speak of deformities and diseases that were concealed or downplayed. Later, India followed with underground tests in the Rajasthan desert in 1974 and again in 1998, which led to tensions with Pakistan. Pakistan, in turn, responded in 1998 with its own tests, which took place in the high mountains of Balochistan. These events showed that the logic of testing was no longer limited to the superpowers, but had extended to regional powers. The political dimensions of the tests were enormous. Every explosion was a message to the enemy and to the world. When the Soviet Union detonated the Tsar bomb in 1961, the most powerful nuclear weapon ever built, it was less a military experiment than a political spectacle. With an explosive force of 50 megatons of TNT, Moscow wanted to demonstrate its strength to the world. The explosion was so powerful that it was registered on seismographs worldwide and window panes shattered in Norway and Finland. It was a signal to the US and its allies. The Soviet Union could destroy any place in the world if it wanted to. But the tests also provoked increasing resistance. In the 1950s and 1960s, a global anti-nuclear movement grew that opposed the contamination of the environment and the endangerment of future generations. In particular, the danger of radioactive fallout became apparent. Strontium-90, a byproduct of the explosions, entered the milk and bones of children through the food chain. Scientific studies proved the growing risks, and the protests became louder. Mothers, students, doctors, and scientists took to the streets. In Great Britain, the campaign for nuclear disarmament emerged. In the USA, citizens organized themselves in protest movements, and a network of resistance emerged worldwide. Politicians could not ignore this pressure. In 1963, the USA, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain signed the Partial Stop Treaty, which prohibited above-ground tests and limited them to underground explosions. This reduced the most visible and dangerous form of testing, but they continued underground. The superpowers conducted hundreds of such tests, which released less fallout into the atmosphere, but still triggered earthquakes and contaminated groundwater. It was not until 1996 that a global ban was adopted with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but it never came into full force because some important countries, including the USA and China, did not ratify it. The history of atomic bomb tests shows how closely technology, politics, and the environment are intertwined. Each test was a triumph of engineering, a signal of power, and at the same time an ecological catastrophe. Entire regions were rendered uninhabitable for centuries, and countless people suffered from the invisible consequences. For the affected populations, the tests were not an abstract geopolitical game, but a daily reality of disease, fear, and destruction of their livelihoods. The era of testing also illustrates the absurdity of the arms race. Ever larger warheads were detonated, although it had long been clear that just a few dozen bombs would be enough to destroy civilization. Nevertheless, the logic of deterrence prevailed. They wanted to prove to the enemy that they were always one step ahead. There was a dangerous irrationality in this dynamic that was difficult to stop. It was only the massive protests and the growing awareness of the environmental consequences that forced politicians to give in. Today, many former test sites are considered memorials. In New Mexico, the Trinity Site Memorial commemorates the first test. In the Marshall Islands, people are still fighting for recognition and compensation, and in Kazakhstan, the former test site of Semipalatinsk has become a symbol of suffering and resistance. International days of remembrance commemorate the victims, and many survivors are committed to ensuring that the horrors of the tests are not forgotten. Atomic bomb tests worldwide were thus much more than technical experiments. They were part of a global staging of power, they triggered a new environmental movement, and they are still sources of suffering and memory today. They make it clear that the history of nuclear weapons is not only a history of politics and strategy, but also a history of the people who lived and suffered in the radiation corridors of the superpowers. Chapter 11. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. October 1962 was one of the most dangerous moments in human history. In those 13 days, the world was closer to the brink of nuclear war than ever before. The Cuban Missile Crisis became the epitome of the Cold War, an event that exacerbated the balance of superpowers while demonstrating the fragility of the logic of deterrence. It revealed that not only long-term strategies, but also misunderstandings, wrong decisions, and coincidences can determine the course of history. The history of the crisis dates back to 1959, when Fidel Castro took power in Cuba. The revolution overthrew the regime of Fulgencio Batista and produced a government that was increasingly leaning on the Soviet Union. This was a shock for the USA. Suddenly, there was a communist regime just 150 kilometers off the coast of Florida. Tensions escalated in 1961 when the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion failed miserably. The US had hoped to overthrow Castro's government, but the opposite happened. Cuba moved even closer to Moscow, and Castro saw his hostility to Washington confirmed. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet party leader, saw an opportunity in Cuba. By stationing nuclear missiles on the island, he was able to compensate for the nuclear imbalance. Until then, the United States had a clear advantage. It had a large arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles and bombers, while the Soviet systems were still immature. At the same time, the US had stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey that posed a direct threat to Moscow. Therefore, from the Soviet point of view, it was only fair to place similar weapons within range of American territory. In the summer of 1962, Soviet ships began secretly bringing missiles, warheads, and troops to Cuba. It was one of the largest covert operations of the Cold War. But in October, American reconnaissance aircraft discovered the missile sites. President John F. Kennedy was informed, and a crisis broke out that placed the fate of the world in the hands of a few men. Kennedy was faced with a difficult decision. An immediate airstrike on the missile sites would have removed the threat, but it risked that Soviet soldiers would be killed and Moscow would respond with counterstrikes. An invasion of Cuba would have escalated the conflict even further. On the other hand, the US could not accept that nuclear missiles were stationed just minutes from Washington. Kennedy chose a middle ground, a naval blockade, officially called a quarantine. This was to prevent more missiles from being brought into Cuba while at the same time gaining time for negotiations. The world public learned of the crisis on October 22, 1962, when Kennedy made the Soviet missile deployments public in a televised address. Millions of people listened spellbound as the president declared that the US would impose a blockade and respond with massive retaliation in the event of an attack. The words were clear and harsh, and they made it clear that the United States was prepared to risk war if necessary. In the days that followed, the situation escalated dramatically. American warships confronted Soviet freighters heading for Cuba. U-2 reconnaissance planes flew over the island, and one such flight ended with the shooting down of an American pilot by Cuban anti-aircraft defenses, an event that could have escalated the situation at any time. The XCOM, a secret advisory body that helped Kennedy plan the next steps, met in Washington. There, different positions clashed. Military officials demanded hard blows, diplomats pleaded for negotiations, and Kennedy himself tried to find a way out that showed strength without making war inevitable. Discussions also raged in Moscow. Khrushchev had hoped to keep the missile deployments secret until they were operational. Now he was under enormous pressure. On the one hand, he did not want to give in and endanger the credibility of the Soviet Union, but on the other hand, he knew that a nuclear war would be catastrophic for all sides. In this atmosphere, secret messages began to circulate between Washington and Moscow, sometimes threatening, sometimes appeasing. On October 26, the White House received a letter from Khrushchev in which he proposed a way out. The Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles from Cuba if the United States refrained from invading the island in return. The next day, however, a tougher letter arrived, in which Moscow also demanded the withdrawal of American missiles from Turkey. Kennedy and his advisors were faced with a dilemma. Should they accept the first offer or respond to the second, tougher demand? In the end, it was decided to officially reply only to the first letter, while unofficially signaling that the Turkish missiles would soon be withdrawn anyway. On October 28, Khrushchev finally gave in. In a radio message, he explained that the Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba. In return, the US assured that it would not attack Cuba. The world breathed a sigh of relief. A nuclear war was averted, and both sides were able to save face. The Soviet Union had secured Cuba, the USA had achieved the withdrawal of the missiles. However, the Cuban Missile Crisis had left deep marks. It showed how dangerous the logic of deterrence was when both sides operated with sharp threats and there was little room for misunderstanding. The 13 days had shown humanity that survival could not be taken for granted. Millions of people followed the news with fear, schools held emergency drills, families wondered if they would live to see the next day. This experience shaped an entire generation. The crisis had important consequences for politics. In Washington, John F. Kennedy gained prestige because he was considered a level-headed leader who had shown strength and restraint at the same time. In Moscow, on the other hand, the episode weakened Khrushchev, as many in the Soviet leadership perceived the withdrawal of the missiles as a defeat. A few years later, he was deposed, also because of his handling of this crisis. Above all, however, the Cuban Missile Crisis led to new efforts in arms control. Both sides realized that a direct communication channel was necessary to avoid misunderstandings in the future. This is how the famous Red Telephone was born, a direct link between Washington and Moscow. This was followed in 1963 by the treaty banning atmospheric nuclear tests, a first step towards containing the dangers of nuclear escalation. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 remains a lesson to this day. It shows how quickly national interests and geopolitical rivalries can drive the world to the brink of the abyss, and it highlights the importance of communication, diplomacy, and prudence in times of greatest danger. It is also a reminder that the existence of nuclear weapons always carries the risk of catastrophe, not only by intention, but also by error and chance. Looking back on those days, it is clear that humanity got away with luck. A different decision, a different interpretation of a telegram, another shooting down of an aeroplane, and the story could have ended very differently. The fact that this did not happen was not a sign that nuclear weapons guarantee security, but rather proof of how fragile the balance of terror was. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a moment when the world collectively realized how thin the line is that separates civilization from annihilation. Chapter 12: Nuclear Weapons in Europe. After 1945, Europe was the central battlefield of the Cold War, and it also became the densest staging zone for nuclear weapons. While the United States and the Soviet Union expanded their superpower positions, divided Europe was the focus of their confrontation. No other region in the world has been so strongly marked by the presence of nuclear weapons, and no other has lived so intensely with the fear of being the first to be destroyed in the event of a conflict. Nuclear weapons in Europe meant deterrence, protection, and threat at the same time. They changed politics, society, and culture and left a legacy that still has an impact today. Immediately after the Second World War, two blocs faced each other in Europe, the border of which ran through the middle of Germany. The West was involved in the NATO alliance, which was founded in 1949, while the East was organized in the Warsaw Pact under the leadership of the Soviet Union. Both sides saw Central Europe as a potential battlefield of a future war. It became clear early on that conventional armed forces alone would not be enough to keep the balance. NATO therefore relied on nuclear weapons as an integral part of its defense strategy. In the 1950s, the stationing of American nuclear weapons in Europe began. Initially, these were tactical bombs, artillery shells, and missiles with a relatively short range. In an emergency, they were to be used against Soviet tank formations that would advance westwards from Eastern Europe in an attack. Soon, however, medium-range missiles were added, which could reach deep into the Soviet hinterland. For the United States, the deployment was part of its forward defense, a strategy to prevent an attack on Europe from leading to a loss of credibility of the American guarantee of protection. For the Europeans, it meant that their continent became a nuclear front line. The Federal Republic of Germany played a key role in this. As a frontline state in the Cold War, it was the venue for a massive rearmament. In the 1960s and 1970s, thousands of nuclear warheads were under American control in West Germany. Great Britain and Italy also harbored nuclear weapons, and France even went its own way. Under President Charles de Gaulle, the country developed a national force de frappe, an independent nuclear force that was not to be solely dependent on NATO strategy. Great Britain had already tested its first bomb of its own in 1952 and since then has relied on close cooperation with the United States. This turned Western Europe into a patchwork of different nuclear systems, all of which served one goal: to deter the Soviet Union. On the other side of the front line, Moscow responded by stationing its own weapons. Soviet nuclear systems were located throughout the territory of the Warsaw Pact, from East Germany to Poland and Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union itself was also able to reach targets in Europe and America with intercontinental ballistic missiles. This means that millions of Europeans live with the constant certainty that they will be among the first victims of a nuclear war in an emergency. Maps by Western strategists showed that a nuclear exchange would likely take place first in Central Europe, a scenario that would have reduced the continent to rubble. This permanent threat shaped political debates in Europe. In the 1950s and 1960s, a certain fatalism still prevailed in many countries. The presence of nuclear weapons was accepted as a necessary evil in the Cold War. But in the 1970s and 1980s, resistance grew. In particular, the stationing of new medium-range missiles in the 1980s, the American Pershing II missiles and cruise missiles, triggered a wave of protests. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in Bonn, London, Amsterdam, and Rome. Peace movements organized sit-ins in front of military bases, churches became involved against nuclear armament, and the fear of a nuclear war by mistake became the dominant topic. NATO had declared with the so-called double-track decision of 1979 that it would station new missiles if the Soviet Union was not willing to dismantle its SS-20 medium-range missiles. Moscow refused, and so a new phase of nuclear escalation began in the early 1980s. For many people in Europe, it was a moment when the balance of terror was immediately felt. The demonstrations of 1981 and 1983 are among the largest mass movements in the history of the Federal Republic. Slogans such as "Better Red Than Dead" or "Creating Peace Without Weapons" shaped political culture, and the fear of nuclear doom was processed in literature, film, and music. The mood was also tense in Eastern Europe, but open protests were hardly possible there. Nevertheless, rumors circulated about accidents, about the consequences of stationing, and about the impossibility of protecting oneself in an emergency. The population's trust in the official security promises was low. Many people felt that they were living between the fronts of the superpowers without having any influence on the decisions. The stationing of nuclear weapons in Europe also had a diplomatic dimension. On the one hand, the European states were dependent on the protective umbrella of the USA, but on the other hand, they did not want to lose control completely. This led to tensions within NATO. France deliberately distanced itself from Washington with its independent force de frappe, while other countries such as the Federal Republic of Germany remained closely involved. There were also disputes within West German politics. While conservative parties defended the stationing, a new political force, the Greens, formed in the 1980s, which owed its rise not least to the protest against nuclear weapons. In the 1980s, the situation came to a head again when the rhetorical confrontation between Ronald Reagan and the Soviet leadership unsettled the world. At the same time, however, new arms control negotiations began, which finally culminated in the INF Treaty of 1987. This treaty between the USA and the Soviet Union banned an entire category of nuclear weapons for the first time, land-based intermediate-range missiles. For Europe, this was a historic moment, because it meant the withdrawal of the Pershing II and SS-20 systems and thus a noticeable relief. Nevertheless, nuclear weapons remained present in Europe even after the end of the Cold War. In Great Britain and France, governments continued to maintain their own nuclear forces, and in several NATO countries, including Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey, American nuclear weapons are still stored today as part of nuclear sharing. This means that Europe is still a continent where nuclear weapons are not only a symbol of the past, but also part of the security policy present. The history of nuclear weapons in Europe is thus a history of threat and resistance, of strategic calculation and social mobilization. It shows how strongly a continent can be shaped when it becomes the front line of a global confrontation. Millions of people grew up with the fear that their homeland would be nothing more than a radioactive field of rubble in the event of an emergency. At the same time, it was precisely this threat that led to the emergence of one of the largest peace movements in world history in Europe. Looking back at this era, one recognizes the paradox. Nuclear weapons were supposed to provide protection, but at the same time they made Europe more vulnerable than any other region. They were supposed to secure peace, but they brought millions of people onto the streets who saw precisely this peace endangered. Europe was not only a geopolitical chessboard during the Cold War, it was also a laboratory of nuclear fear, a place where the balance of terror was most immediately apparent. Chapter 13: Non-Proliferation and Arms Control. Since the early days of the nuclear age, the question has been whether it is possible to contain the further proliferation of nuclear weapons and limit the arms race. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shown how terrible these weapons were, but they had also exposed the enormous prestige and power associated with their possession. No state that once saw itself in a position to build nuclear weapons could ever forget this knowledge again. This began a permanent struggle between two opposing tendencies: the striving for control and disarmament on the one hand, and the urge for possession and modernization on the other. The history of non-proliferation and arms control is therefore a constant struggle, full of progress, setbacks, and unfinished promises. Shortly after the Second World War, the first ideas emerged on how nuclear energy could be placed under international control. The so-called Baruch Plan of 1946 proposed that a UN agency should monitor all nuclear weapons and strictly regulate access to fissile materials. The United States wanted to prevent other countries from following the example of the Soviet Union. But Moscow refused, as the plan would have left American nuclear weapons untouched for the time being. This early failure showed how difficult it would be to find common rules as long as mistrust and rivalry dominated world politics. In the 1950s and 1960s, the number of nuclear powers grew. Great Britain detonated its first bomb in 1952, France in 1960, and China in 1964. Israel worked secretly on its own program. India built civilian reactors that could later be used for military purposes. At the same time, the civilian use of nuclear energy began, which had been propagated worldwide since Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech in 1953. Hundreds of reactors were built, officially to produce electricity, but there was always the danger of the so-called dual-use problem. Technologies that supply energy can also be misused to build weapons. The growing number of states with nuclear potential led to the first serious efforts to establish rules on non-proliferation. In 1968, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT for short, was adopted. To this day, it is considered one of the central pillars of international arms control. His basic idea was simple but ambivalent. The five official nuclear powers at the time, the USA, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China, were allowed to keep their weapons, while all other states committed themselves not to develop any. In return, they received the right to civilian use of nuclear energy and the promise that the nuclear states would seriously negotiate disarmament. The NPT was a milestone, but it also reflected the inequality of the world order. Critics accused him of creating a two-class system: privileged nuclear powers on the one hand, disempowered non-nuclear states on the other. Nevertheless, most countries signed, recognizing that an uncontrolled race would lead to incalculable risks. To this day, almost all countries in the world are members. Only a few, such as India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, are outside. Parallel to the NPT, bilateral efforts developed between the superpowers to contain the arms race. Talks about limiting strategic weapons began as early as the 1960s. This resulted in the SALT negotiations, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. In 1972, Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev signed the SALT-I Treaty, which for the first time limited the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles. At the same time, the ABM Treaty was concluded, which severely restricted missile defense systems. The logic behind this was clear. If neither side could protect itself by defending itself, the balance of deterrence was maintained and the danger of a first strike decreased. In the 1980s, the START negotiations, Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, followed, which aimed to achieve an actual reduction. Under Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, decisive steps were taken. The INF Treaty of 1987 in particular was a breakthrough. For the first time, an entire category of weapons was abolished: the land-based intermediate-range missiles in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people who had demonstrated against Pershing II and SS-20 missiles in previous years saw this as a confirmation of their commitment. Despite this progress, the picture remained contradictory. Although certain systems were limited or abolished, the superpowers were constantly developing new technologies. The number of warheads rose to over 60,000 worldwide by the 1980s. Missiles with multiple warheads, MIRVs, made the containment even more difficult, as a single missile could suddenly destroy dozens of targets. In addition, the modernization of arsenals remained a constant process, so old warheads were replaced by more precise and powerful ones. Non-proliferation also repeatedly reached its limits. India conducted its first peaceful nuclear test in 1974, which effectively meant entry into the world of nuclear weapons. Pakistan followed suit in the 1990s, driven by rivalry with India. Israel secretly built up its own arsenal, which was never officially confirmed, but widely accepted. North Korea initially joined the NPT, but later broke it and developed its own warheads. This showed that although the treaty bound many countries, it could not stop determined states permanently. Another focus of arms control was the attempt to ban tests. Above-ground tests had triggered massive protests in the 1950s and 1960s, as radioactive fallout was detectable worldwide. In 1963, the USA, the Soviet Union and Great Britain agreed on the Partial Stop Treaty, which prohibited above-ground tests. But underground explosions continued, and it was not until 1996 that a comprehensive ban was passed with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT. However, it has not yet come into force because important countries such as the USA, China, India, and Pakistan have not ratified it. Arms control has therefore always been a balancing act between progress and stagnation. On the one hand, there were contracts that were intended to create trust and reduce risk. On the other hand, there was the reality that no great power was willing to completely abandon the bomb. For many states, it remained the ultimate security instrument. Even after the end of the Cold War, when the number of warheads was reduced, the US and Russia each kept thousands of weapons on standby. But non-proliferation and arms control were not just a matter of diplomacy. They also had a symbolic and psychological dimension. For many people around the world, treaties such as SALT, START or INF were signs of hope that humanity was learning to take responsibility. The images of Reagan and Gorbachev in Reykjavik or Washington, signing disarmament agreements, were icons of a new hope for peace. At the same time, however, skepticism remained as to whether words and signatures would be enough to change the reality of the arsenals. Today it is clear that arms control is in crisis. Treaties have been terminated, the INF Treaty, for example, in 2019 by the USA and Russia. New technologies such as hypersonic missiles, cyber attacks, and space weapons complicate the old mechanisms. While the NPT remains, many countries consider it insufficient, as the nuclear powers are barely fulfilling their disarmament obligations. The history of non-proliferation and arms control is thus a history of imperfect progress. It shows that humanity has repeatedly tried to close, at least partially, Pandora's box, which it opened in 1945. But it also shows that power interests, mistrust, and geopolitical rivalries have repeatedly undermined these efforts. Perhaps the greatest paradox is that the existence of nuclear weapons creates both the incentive to limit them and the pressure to keep them. Chapter 14: New Nuclear Powers. When the first atomic bombs exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, there was only one country that had this weapon: the United States. 4 years later, the Soviet Union joined in, followed by Great Britain, France, and China. Until the 1960s, it seemed as if nuclear armament would be limited to this exclusive circle of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. But the promise that the number of nuclear states would remain small and manageable was not fulfilled. More and more countries embarked on the path to the bomb, some successfully, others failed or renounced for political reasons. This development shaped the second half of the 20th century, as did the arms race between the superpowers, and made the world order even more complicated. The first big surprise came in 1960, when France tested its own atomic bomb. President Charles de Gaulle had set himself the task of giving France an independent strategic position. He distrusted the absolute dependence on the USA and wanted to ensure that Paris could act independently in an emergency. The Force de Frappe was a French nuclear force that initially consisted of bombers, later missiles, and submarines. France saw itself not only as the protecting power of Europe, but also as a global power that wanted to preserve its independence. Although this decision was met with criticism, it made France an independent player in the nuclear game of the great powers. China followed shortly afterwards. Under Mao Zedong, the country began an ambitious program that, despite poverty and political turbulence, resulted in the first Chinese atomic bomb in 1964. For Beijing, possession of the bomb was more than just a military advantage. It was a symbol of national greatness, an insurance policy against the superpowers, and an instrument for being taken seriously in international politics. In the decades that followed, China gradually built up an arsenal that, while smaller than that of the United States or the Soviet Union, was still sufficient to threaten their territory. With this step, it was clear that nuclear power was no longer an exclusive Western privilege. In addition to these 5 official nuclear powers, which were also recognized in the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty, other countries began their own programs. Israel in particular is considered the classic example of an unofficial nuclear power. As early as the 1950s, the country began to build a secret reactor site in the Negev with French help. Officially, there was talk of civilian research, but internationally it soon became clear that Israel was working towards a bomb. In the 1960s, it probably already had functional warheads, although there is still no official confirmation. Israel pursues the policy of nuclear ambiguity. It does not deny, it does not confirm, but it leaves no doubt that it has nuclear weapons in case of emergency. This strategy is intended to deter without provoking open provocations. For its neighbors in the Middle East, Israel's nuclear potential was and is a permanent factor of tension. India also entered the circle of nuclear powers, albeit in a special form. In 1974, it detonated its first bomb in Rajasthan, which was officially called a peaceful nuclear test. But the euphemism could not hide the fact that India had thus taken the step into military use. For New Delhi, The rivalry with China played a central role, as did the claim to play a leading role in the Third World. For a long time, India limited itself to a small number of warheads, but in the 1990s further tests followed, which finally confirmed the military dimension. Pakistan's path to the bomb was almost inevitably the reaction to India. After the defeat in the 1971 war and the secession of Bangladesh, the political leadership vowed that it would never be so vulnerable again. With the help of international networks, including the notorious nuclear scientist Abdul Qadir Khan, Pakistan managed to procure the necessary know-how and material. In 1998, the country officially tested its first nuclear weapons, just a few days after India. South Asia had thus become a region in which two hostile neighbors had nuclear arsenals, a dangerous constellation that repeatedly triggered crises in the years that followed. North Korea is a special case. The country began developing nuclear capabilities in the 1980s, initially acceding to the Non-Proliferation Treaty but later breaking it. In the 2000s, North Korea detonated its first test bombs. The regime in Pyongyang sees the bomb as survival insurance. It is intended to prevent the country from being overthrown by foreign intervention like Iraq or Libya. Despite international sanctions and diplomatic efforts, North Korea is sticking to its program and is now considered a nuclear power, even if its arsenal is small and technically limited. In addition to these countries, there were numerous other attempts to build the bomb. South Africa did indeed develop several functional warheads in the 1970s and 1980s, but voluntarily abandoned them in the early 1990s when the apartheid regime was coming to an end. To this day, it remains the only country that has actively produced nuclear weapons and then abolished them again. Other countries such as Brazil, Argentina, Libya, Iraq, or Syria worked on programs at times, but abandoned them or were stopped by international pressure. The increasing number of nuclear powers posed enormous challenges to the international order. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was able to slow down the spread, but not prevent it. With each new nuclear power, the danger became more complex. Conflicts that had previously been regionally limited now took on a nuclear dimension. The Middle East and South Asia in particular showed how quickly political crises could become global threats. The new nuclear powers also changed the logic of deterrence. While there was a certain balance between the superpowers, this was much more difficult in regional conflicts. India and Pakistan have been on the brink of war on several occasions, such as in the Kargil War in 1999 or during the terrorist attacks of 2001 and 2008. In each case, the fear of nuclear escalation played a central role. Israel's arsenal also creates a complicated situation in the Middle East. Arab states and Iran regularly criticize the double standards that Israel is allowed to possess weapons while they are denied it. The new nuclear powers are therefore not only an addition to the old nuclear club, but a challenge for international security as a whole. They show that the logic of the bomb is universal. States that feel threatened or seek prestige try to acquire it. At the same time, they illustrate the limits of control. Even strict treaties, sanctions, and surveillance systems cannot always stop determined governments. To this day, the question of how to deal with this reality remains open. On the one hand, there are efforts to prevent new states from building the bomb, as in the case of the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. On the other hand, it is accepted that countries such as India, Pakistan, or Israel are de facto nuclear powers, even if they are outside the NPT. This means that the world lives with a kind of grey zone, officially limited payments to states, but unofficially a wider distribution. The history of the new nuclear powers is therefore also a history of ambivalence. It shows that the bomb is not only a weapon of the superpowers, but also has an irresistible attraction for regional powers. It makes it clear that prestige, security, and deterrence are universal driving forces. And she underlines that the hope that the bomb could be limited to a handful of states forever has long since failed. Chapter 15: Nuclear Weapons and Deterrence. Hardly any other idea has shaped international politics as much as the concept of nuclear deterrence. Since the early years of the Cold War, it has served as a central argument to justify the existence of nuclear weapons. The logic was as simple as it was frightening. No one would dare to use these weapons if they had to expect to be destroyed in a counterattack. This gave rise to the principle of the balance of terror, which was supposed to secure peace for decades, or rather, prevent a major war while smaller conflicts remained possible. Deterrence became a kind of unwritten social contract between the nuclear powers, but it was fragile, full of contradictions and riddled with numerous dangers. The theoretical basis of deterrence developed in parallel with technical rearmament. As early as the 1950s, it became clear that nuclear weapons could no longer be understood as tactical battlefield weapons. Although they experimented with nuclear grenades, missiles, and even warheads for artillery pieces, the real explosive power lay in the strategic weapons: intercontinental ballistic missiles, bomber fleets, and submarines capable of completely destroying the enemy's territory. In this scenario, there could be no winner. An attack would inevitably provoke a retaliation, and in the end there would be the annihilation of both sides. In the USA, this developed into the concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short, a cynical term that translates as mutually assured destruction, but also contains the English word for insane. This concept stated that stability would not be achieved through arms control or disarmament, but through the secure knowledge that a nuclear war would know no winners. Paradoxically, then, the very existence of weapons was supposed to guarantee peace. Politicians and military officials said that nuclear weapons were too terrible to use, and that is precisely why no one had an interest in actually firing them. But the theory was never as stable as it sounded. Again and again, questions arose. What if one side believed that it could eliminate the enemy's weapons by a first strike? What if technical systems failed or false alarms simulated an attack? What if political leaders acted irrationally or made decisions under pressure? In the 1960s, the strategy of the second strike capability was therefore developed. It was supposed to guarantee that even after a massive first strike, enough weapons would still be ready for use to destroy the enemy. This made the stationing of missile submarines crucial, because they could survive hidden in the world's oceans and strike back at any time. Mutual deterrence shaped not only military planning, but also the thinking of entire generations. Films, literature, and art reflected the fear of nuclear doom. Scenarios of a nuclear winter, in which the smoke from thousands of burning cities would block sunlight, made the rounds. Scientists such as Carl Sagan warned of the ecological consequences of nuclear war, which would affect even countries that were not directly bombed. Deterrence guaranteed an unstable peace, but it was based on the threat of the apocalypse. In practice, the concept led to a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, there was no direct war between the superpowers in the second half of the 20th century, an argument for the effectiveness of deterrence. On the other hand, there were repeated crises in which the world narrowly missed the catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is the best-known example, but other incidents such as the false alarms in Soviet early warning systems in the 1980s also show how thin the line between security and annihilation was. Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov, for example, may have prevented the outbreak of nuclear war in 1983 by refusing to report an alleged attack. The extension of nuclear weapons to new states also put the logic of deterrence to the test. While there was some balance between the US and the Soviet Union, this was much more uncertain in regional conflicts. India and Pakistan, for example, waged war in the Kargil Mountains in 1999, just 1 year after their official nuclear tests. Both sides indirectly threatened escalation, and the international community feared that a regional conflict in South Asia could derail nuclearly. Even in the Middle East, where Israel presumably has an arsenal, the question of deterrence is more complicated, as there are no clear channels of communication and no established mechanisms as between the superpowers. Deterrence also had a domestic political dimension. In the USA, it was used to justify gigantic arms budgets. Every hint of Soviet progress led to new programs, whether they were missile defense systems, new bombers, or modernized warheads. In the Soviet Union, on the other hand, parity with the USA was a central pillar of national self-confidence. Nuclear weapons were not only weapons, but symbols of superpower. Those who owned it were able to gain international respect. Anyone who remained without them risked being blackmailed. The proponents of deterrence argued that it was precisely this logic that prevented World War III. They pointed out that despite the high tensions, no global war broke out, while the two world wars without nuclear weapons claimed millions of victims in a very short time. For them, the bomb was the ultimate instrument of peace. Critics, on the other hand, saw it as a sword of Damocles that threatened countless lives every day. They referred to the constant danger of false alarms, accidents, or abuse by unpredictable actors. In the 1980s, the debate gained new intensity when Ronald Reagan spoke of the possibility of overcoming the logic of deterrence through missile defense systems, the so-called SDI program, also known as Star Wars. The aim was to intercept enemy missiles and thus reduce the vulnerability of the USA. Critics, however, warned that this would destabilize the balance. If one side believed it could protect itself, the other would try to overcome the defense with even more weapons. Here, too, the paradox became apparent. Every supposed increase in security led to new uncertainty in the end. Today, the concept of deterrence is still central, but the conditions have changed. The bipolar world of the Cold War no longer exists. Instead, there are several nuclear powers with different interests. The US and Russia still have the largest arsenals, but China is expanding its arsenal, India and Pakistan are hostile to each other, North Korea is provoking the international community, and Israel is sticking to its policy of ambiguity. In a multipolar world, the stability of deterrence is far more difficult to guarantee than between two superpowers. In addition, there is the danger of new technologies. Cyber attacks could manipulate missile warning systems or disrupt communication channels. Hypersonic missiles dramatically shorten the warning times and increase the risk of wrong decisions. Space is also increasingly seen as a potential battlefield in which satellites, which are crucial for surveillance and communication, could be attacked. All this makes the classical theory of deterrence more insecure and fragile. Deterrence is therefore not a firm guarantee, but a risky game that has worked so far, but could fail at any time. It has prevented the Great War, but it has also put the world in constant fear. It has created stability, but on the basis of threats that would lead to self-destruction in an emergency. Perhaps the greatest irony is that humanity has been living in a state that can be described as peace through fear for over 70 years. Nuclear weapons and deterrence have prevented the world powers from facing each other directly in an all-out war. But this peace is a fragile, uncertain, dependent one on rationality, luck, and chance. Deterrence is not a sure protection, but a constant balancing act on the edge of the abyss. Chapter 16: Nuclear Weapons and Society. Nuclear weapons have never been just a topic of high politics or military strategy. They also changed the societies in which they existed and shaped the mentality of entire generations. Hardly any other technological development of the 20th century has had such a profound influence on the collective consciousness as the bomb. It was at the same time a symbol of progress and destruction, of security and threat. While politicians and military officials debated deployment scenarios and deterrence, millions of people lived in the shadow of a potential catastrophe. This constant presence of the unspeakable had an effect on politics, culture, art, religion, and everyday life, sometimes visibly, sometimes subliminally, but always perceptibly. Immediately after 1945, societies reacted very differently to the new reality. In the United States, pride initially prevailed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were often justified in public accounts as necessary acts that would have ended the war and saved American lives. The atomic bomb became a symbol of national superiority in popular magazines, comics, and films. In the 1950s, the US government even presented nuclear power as a beacon of hope for a bright future. Unlimited energy, new medical possibilities, even visions of flying cars and nuclear-powered aircraft. Under the slogan Atoms for Peace, international conferences were held to highlight the positive sides of nuclear energy. But at the same time, there was always the other, dark side, the fear of total annihilation. In Europe, the social reaction was different. There, the memory of the war was closer, and the stationing of nuclear weapons directly on its own territory aroused unease. Especially in the 1970s and 1980s, the peace movements grew into a powerful social force. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to protest against new medium-range missiles. Churches, trade unions, intellectuals, and young people united in protest against the balance of terror. Nuclear weapons became the moral touchstone on which political parties and social movements were formed. In Germany, for example, the dispute over the NATO double-track decision played a central role in the rise of the Greens. A unique culture of remembrance also developed in Japan. As the only country to have suffered a nuclear attack, it became the center of a worldwide peace movement. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Hibakusha, tirelessly reported on their experiences. Their voices shaped the collective memory. Their testimonies became moral appeals to the world never to use such a weapon again. Every year on August the 6th and 9th, commemorations are held in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which have become international meeting places for activists, politicians, and scientists. Japan thus became a moral reminder that nuclear weapons have not only a military dimension, but above all a human dimension. Everyday culture also reflected the nuclear threat. In the USA, civil defense exercises became routine in the 1950s. Children learned to duck under the school desk in the event of an attack, families set up shelters in basements, and brochures explained how to survive a nuclear strike. Even if many of these measures would have been useless in an emergency, they shaped the attitude to life. An entire generation grew up with the idea that the world could go up in flames at any time. This diffuse fear permeated films, music, and literature. Hollywood brought disaster scenarios to the screen, science fiction authors described apocalyptic images of the future, and musicians processed the topic in protest songs. Religion also responded to the nuclear challenge. Churches discussed whether the threat of nuclear weapons was morally justifiable. In the 1980s, the Catholic Church in the USA published a famous pastoral message in which it accepted deterrence as a temporary evil, but at the same time called for its abolition. The Pope also repeatedly spoke of the sin of nuclear armament. Other religious communities made similar statements, so that the bomb became a touchstone of fundamental ethical questions. Is it permissible to threaten the annihilation of all humanity even if one hopes never to use the weapons? For the scientists who had developed the bomb, this question was particularly acute. After 1945, many of them became involved in movements against further rearmament. Albert Einstein, who was not directly involved in the development himself, warned urgently of the dangers. Robert Oppenheimer spoke of the scientists having known sin. Organizations such as the Pugwash Conferences brought together scholars from East and West to take joint responsibility. These initiatives were important contributions to the policy of détente and arms control. But at the same time, many other researchers were working on improving warheads, delivery systems, and defense strategies. This showed that the scientific community itself was deeply divided. The social debate on nuclear weapons has always been ambivalent. On the one hand, there was fascination and pride, the bomb as a symbol of technical ingenuity and political power. On the other hand, there was fear, rejection, and moral indignation. This field of tension runs through the entire second half of the 20th century. Even in pop culture, both sides appeared. Films like Dr. Strangelove mocked the logic of deterrence, while at the same time comics and advertising celebrated nuclear power as a vision of the future. The relationship between the state and the citizen also changed. The permanent nuclear threat led to a stronger role for the military and intelligence services. At the same time, the need for transparency and co-determination grew. Movements for disarmament and non-proliferation pushed for democratic control of the arsenals. In many countries, debates have been held about whether governments have the right to concentrate decisions about the survival of humanity in a few hands. Nuclear weapons pose the fundamental questions of democracy, sovereignty, and responsibility anew. With the end of the Cold War, the threat initially seemed to decrease. Many people breathed a sigh of relief when disarmament treaties were signed in the 1990s and the number of warheads fell. But the social debate never quite stopped. In the 2000s, as new nuclear powers such as North Korea emerged and terrorism became a global concern, the debate returned. Now it was no longer just about superpowers, but about the danger that smaller states or even non-state actors could gain access to nuclear material. Societies reacted with new concern, and the old peace movements regained traction. Today, the relationship between nuclear weapons and society is more complex than ever. In some countries, such as North Korea, the bomb is celebrated as a proud symbol of survival. In others, such as Japan or Germany, it is a trigger for deep moral debates. In the USA and Russia, it is an accepted part of security policy on the one hand, and the subject of ongoing criticism on the other. And a new generation of activists is growing around the world who see the UN's 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as a historic step forward. The bomb is therefore not only a political or military instrument, it is a social factor. It shapes how people think about security, power, morality, and the future. It forces individuals to confront the possibility of their own annihilation, and it paradoxically unites humanity in a common threat. The history of nuclear weapons is therefore always a history of the societies that have to live with them, between fear and hope, protest and resignation, pride and guilt. Chapter 17. After the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and the Cold War came to an end, a new chapter in the history of nuclear weapons began. For decades, the world had been marked by the confrontation between the two superpowers, whose nuclear arsenals hovered over humanity like a sword of Damocles. With the collapse of the Eastern Bloc and the collapse of the Soviet Union, an era seemed to have dawned in which disarmament, cooperation, and a departure from the logic of the balance of terror would be possible. In fact, significant progress was made in the 1990s, but at the same time new problems opened up that have not yet been solved. One of the most pressing issues was how to deal with Soviet nuclear weapons. For decades, Moscow had produced thousands of warheads, which were now stored on the territory of several independent states. The situation was particularly delicate in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, which had suddenly become nuclear powers after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The world was faced with the danger that several new states had access to strategic weapons that could change the global balance of power within minutes. Intensive negotiations were held to prevent an uncontrolled arms race. With the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus agreed to give up their nuclear weapons and hand them over to Russia. In return, they received security guarantees from the US, Russia, and the UK. In the case of Ukraine in particular, this guarantee would later prove fragile, but in the 1990s, the nuclear disarmament of these states was considered a great success. At the same time, the US and Russia continued their bilateral disarmament efforts. The START Treaty of 1991 obliged both sides to massively reduce their strategic arsenals. The number of warheads was significantly reduced in the following years, from more than 60,000 worldwide to less than half. In the media, there was often talk of a peace dividend. Resources that had previously flowed into armaments were now to be used for civilian purposes. In many countries, people hoped that the atomic age would gradually come to an end. Another important step was the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, adopted in 1996, which was intended to ban all nuclear tests. While it never fully entered into force because major states such as the US, China, India, and Pakistan did not ratify it, it established a strong norm. Since then, most countries have waived further testing, with the exception of North Korea. At the same time, the system of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, which carries out inspections in member states and is supposed to detect violations, has been strengthened. But as hopeful as the 1990s began, the limits of the new order soon became clear. On the one hand, the number of warheads remained alarmingly high despite reductions. Even after the largest rounds of disarmament, the US and Russia each held several thousand operational warheads, enough to destroy the world several times over. On the other hand, the modernization of the arsenals had never really been stopped. Old systems have been dismantled, but replaced by new, more precise ones. The logic of deterrence remained, even if it was now practiced in a less confrontational atmosphere. Another problem was the risk of further spread. In the 1990s, it became clear that knowledge about the construction of nuclear weapons was no longer limited to a few states. Smuggling networks such as the one around Pakistani scientist Abdul Qadir Khan supplied technologies and blueprints to countries such as Iran, Libya, and North Korea. This showed that the greatest danger after the Cold War was no longer necessarily a global exchange of blows between superpowers, but the uncontrolled spread of nuclear capabilities. North Korea, in particular, began to challenge the international community by withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and advancing its own nuclear weapons program. The question of nuclear safety also came to the fore. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were serious fears that materials and warheads might fall into the wrong hands. Stories about suitcase bombs, about smugglers who wanted to sell uranium or plutonium, and about poorly guarded depots made the rounds. The US therefore launched the so-called Nunlugar program, which provided financial and technical assistance to secure Russian arsenals and destroy surplus material. This program is still considered one of the most successful examples of international cooperation in the field of nuclear safety. In society, the new phase was reflected in an ambivalent relationship. In the 1990s, many people believed that the danger had been averted. The peace movements that had mobilized hundreds of thousands in the 1980s lost momentum. Nuclear weapons seemed to be a relic of bygone times that still existed but no longer posed an immediate threat. At the same time, there remained concern in academia and politics that the inertia of the systems and the risk of regional conflicts could conjure up new dangers. This was particularly evident in the Balkans and the Middle East. The Iraq War of 1991 moved the question of weapons of mass destruction to the center of international politics. Saddam Hussein did not have a functioning nuclear arsenal, but his pursuit of it led to international sanctions and inspections. Later, in 2003, the alleged possession of nuclear weapons became the pretext for the Iraq War, even if the claims turned out to be false. This episode showed that the bomb was not only a real weapon, but also a political one. Even suspicion could trigger wars. In the 2000s, the mood changed again. The attacks of September 11, 2001 led to a new fear of nuclear terrorism. Scenarios in which terrorist groups could build dirty bombs or even gain access to real warheads dominated the debates. States invested billions in securing materials, training experts, and monitoring international trade flows. Nuclear weapons were no longer just symbols of superpower politics, but part of the global security agenda. At the same time, old rivalries began to break out again. Russia under Vladimir Putin once again invested massively in the modernization of its arsenal. The US withdrew from important treaties, such as the ABM Treaty in 2002, which limited missile defense systems. In Europe, the debate grew over the role of American nuclear weapons, which continue to be stored in Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and Turkey. In Asia, tensions between India, Pakistan, and China have become increasingly apparent. The dream of a world without nuclear weapons, which Barack Obama invoked in his famous speech in Prague in 2009, remained unfulfilled. If you look at the 1990s and 2000s, you can see that the end of the Cold War was not the end of the nuclear threat. The danger changed, away from the great exchange of blows between the superpowers, towards regional crises, proliferation, and terrorism. Nuclear weapons remained an integral part of the international order, even if they were at times less visible. At the same time, this epoch has shown that international cooperation is possible. The disarmament of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, the securing of Soviet stockpiles, and the reduction of arsenals in the 1990s were historic successes. But they also showed how fragile such successes can be when the geopolitical framework changes. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which assured Ukraine of security, is now considered by many to be a failed promise since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and began the war against Ukraine in 2022. For many observers, this is a cautionary tale that security guarantees are inadequate without credible defense, and that states may be less willing to give up nuclear weapons in the future. Thus, the period after the Cold War does not mark a clear break, but a transition. The nuclear threat remained, it only took on new forms. The hope for a world without nuclear weapons flared up again and again, but it remained unfulfilled. Instead, History since 1991 shows that the bomb adapts to new realities, to the collapse of empires, to the rise of new powers, to the fear of terrorism. It is a constant companion of world politics, sometimes in the foreground, sometimes in the background, but never disappeared. Chapter 18: Terrorism and Nuclear Threats. With the end of the Cold War, the nuclear danger did not disappear, it only changed its face. While the world had feared escalation between superpowers for decades, a new scenario came to the center of security policy debates in the 1990s and 2000s. The possibility that terrorist organizations or other non-state actors could acquire nuclear weapons or fissile material. This idea seemed unimaginable to many, almost apocalyptic. But the combination of unstable states, unsecured stockpiles, smuggling networks, and the determination of extremist groups made the risk real. The nuclear threat thus became more diffuse, more unpredictable, and in some ways even more frightening than in the days of the clear balance of terror. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the starting point of many fears. Over decades, Moscow had built up the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Suddenly, there was a lack of money to secure the deposits, soldiers received no pay for months, and state controls collapsed. Rumors circulated about suitcase bombs, small tactical explosive devices that had supposedly disappeared. Whether these stories were ever true remained controversial, but they showed the fears of the time. Western intelligence services warned of a black market for uranium and plutonium. In fact, there were several documented cases in the 1990s in which small quantities of fissile material were seized in Eastern Europe or at airports. The US responded with the so-called Nunlugar program, which was intended to secure Russian arsenals, destroy surplus warheads, and dry up the black market. Hundreds of millions of dollars flowed into joint projects in which old silos were welded, reactors were shut down, and scientists were integrated into civilian programs. These efforts greatly reduced the risk, but they did not eliminate the fundamental concern that material could fall into the wrong hands somewhere in the world. The fear of nuclear terrorism took on a new dimension after the attacks of September 11, 2001. The images of the collapsing towers in New York made it clear that terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda were willing to go to any conceivable path to spread terror. In the years that followed, there were increasing reports that Osama bin Laden and his followers had been actively searching for radioactive material. Western intelligence agencies warned that Al-Qaeda had tried to establish contacts with Pakistani scientists and had even run laboratories in Afghanistan to experiment with radiation sources. There was no evidence of a concrete bomb program, but the concern was justified. Even a small success would have triggered a catastrophe. It was not only about the danger of a real nuclear weapon. Experts discussed so-called dirty bombs intensively. These are conventional explosive devices that are combined with radioactive material. They would not have the destructive effect of an atomic bomb, but they could contaminate entire cities, cause panic, and cause enormous economic damage. Since radiation sources are used worldwide in medicine, industry, or research, it seemed quite plausible that terrorists could gain access to them. Simulations in Western capitals showed how even a small explosion with radioactive cesium could make entire neighborhoods uninhabitable. The Iraq War in 2003 was also marked by these fears. The US government under George W. Bush justified the invasion of Baghdad with the suspicion, among other things, that Saddam Hussein could possess or develop weapons of mass destruction. Although it later turned out that there were no active nuclear programs, the episode made it clear how much the fear of nuclear threats determined the thinking of politicians. Even mere suspicion was enough to justify wars. In the years that followed, the international community increasingly focused on securing material. Summits, the so-called nuclear security summits, brought together heads of state and government to agree on progress. Small stocks of highly enriched uranium were transported from research reactors in various countries and brought to Russia or the USA. At the same time, attempts were made to track down the smuggling networks. The case of the Pakistani scientist Abdul Qadir Khan in particular caused a stir. In the 1980s and 1990s, he had built up an extensive network through which he sold know-how and equipment to countries such as North Korea, Iran, and Libya. This case showed that non-state actors did not have to act alone. They often received support from insiders who were willing to pass on dangerous knowledge out of profit or ideology. Despite all the measures, the concern remained that a terrorist group could be successful at some point. Western security agencies discussed scenarios in which a container full of uranium would be smuggled through a port, a dirty bomb would be detonated in a metropolis, or even a small warhead would be diverted from an unstable state. Particularly disturbing was the idea that such an attack would cause not only physical destruction but also psychological chaos. Even the suspicion of radioactive contamination could trigger panic, force evacuations, and shake confidence in state institutions. The debate about nuclear terrorism also made it clear that nuclear weapons could no longer be thought of only in geopolitical categories. While in the Cold War it was clear who was friend and who was foe, now the lines blurred. Terrorist groups are not tied to territories, they have no capitals to deter, and they do not respond to classical diplomacy. This makes the logic of deterrence, which has worked between states for decades, ineffective against non-state actors. This poses a special challenge for the international community. How can a threat be controlled that eludes traditional means of power? This fear was also reflected in society. Films, series, and books dealt with scenarios in which terrorists detonate a bomb in a large city. Political debates revolved around questions of surveillance, airport controls, and container inspections. In many countries, billions have been invested in security technologies, from detectors at ports to satellite surveillance and special forces for nuclear emergencies. Some critics spoke of a culture of fear that was shaped more by potential threats than by real events. But in view of the consequences that a single successful attack would have, caution seemed justified. To date, there has not been a nuclear terrorist attack. Neither a dirty bomb nor a real nuclear weapon has ever exploded in the hands of terrorists. But the possibility remains, and it continues to drive politics and security agencies. Any instability in a country with nuclear potential, any report of the disappearance of radiation sources, any suspicion of smuggling immediately provokes international alert. The nuclear threat of the 21st century is thus less a clear conflict between states than a diffuse, global uncertainty. Nuclear terrorism has changed the way the world thinks about nuclear weapons. In the past, the bomb was primarily a question of strategy and deterrence. Today it is also a question of security, crime, and extremism. This shift makes it clear that nuclear weapons can be controlled not only by treaties and diplomacy, but by a complex network of intelligence services, police, science, and international cooperation. The future will show whether these efforts will be sufficient. The only thing that is certain is that the danger has changed, it has become more subtle, but it has not disappeared. Chapter 19. The 21st Century, New Tensions. The 21st century began with the hope that nuclear weapons could gradually become less important. After the end of the Cold War, the major disarmament treaties had reduced the size of the arsenals, and in the 1990s some observers spoke of nuclear peace. But this confidence was deceptive. Soon, new tensions arose, reactivating old lines of conflict and making new threats visible. Nuclear weapons did not become obsolete, but turned into an instrument that played different roles in an increasingly multipolar international system. The 21st century is marked by modernization, geopolitical rivalries, and the failure of collective security mechanisms, all under the continued presence of the bomb. Right from the start, the attacks of September 11, 2001 shaped the international security situation. The US saw itself threatened not only by terrorism, but also by the danger that rogue states could acquire weapons of mass destruction. President George W. Bush spoke of an axis of evil to which he included Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. This rhetoric linked nuclear threats to the fight against terrorism and led to the Iraq War in 2003. Even though it later turned out that Saddam Hussein did not possess nuclear weapons, the episode showed how strongly the bomb continued to serve as a political argument. Even the suspicion that someone might be working on it was enough to legitimize a military intervention. Meanwhile, concern about North Korea grew. In the 1990s, the country had entered into agreements to freeze its nuclear program, but in 2003 it officially withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. From 2006 onwards, several nuclear tests followed, accompanied by missile tests, which made it clear that Pyongyang was determined to build up an operational arsenal. In the 2010s, the regime even announced that it had hydrogen bombs and tested intercontinental ballistic missiles that could theoretically reach the United States. This made North Korea perhaps the greatest nuclear challenge of our time, an isolated country that sees its weapons not as a bargaining chip but as survival insurance. At the same time, Iran also remained in focus. For a long time, Western states suspected that Tehran was pursuing a secret nuclear weapons program. Intensive diplomatic efforts led to the nuclear deal in 2015, which officially became known as the JCPOA. Iran pledged to severely limit its uranium enrichment and allow international inspections while sanctions were eased. But the agreement remained controversial. In the US, many politicians rejected it, and in 2018 President Donald Trump announced the phase-out. Since then, Iran has expanded its activities again, and there is growing concern that the country is getting closer to the bomb. This example shows how fragile self-negotiated compromises can be when trust is lacking and geopolitical interests prevail. The major nuclear powers themselves also moved back into the spotlight. The United States and Russia, which together possess over 90% of all warheads, maintained further reductions, but at the same time began comprehensive modernization programs. Old missiles and submarines were replaced by new ones, warheads were given improved accuracy, and new technologies such as hypersonic weapons and missile defense systems changed the strategic balance. The 1987 INF Treaty, long a symbol of successful arms control, was terminated in 2019 after both sides accused each other of treaty violations. This meant that one of the central pillars of European security fell. Russia's role changed especially after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the war against Ukraine from 2022 onwards, with Moscow repeatedly resorting to nuclear threats to deter the West from direct intervention. President Vladimir Putin spoke openly about the operational readiness of his armed forces and had new weapon systems presented, including hypersonic missiles and underwater drones with nuclear armament. The return of such rhetoric made it clear that nuclear weapons can serve not only as strategic insurance, but also as a means of exerting political pressure. The risk of escalation due to misunderstandings or exaggerations thus increased again. China, on the other hand, began to massively expand its arsenal in the 21st century. For a long time, Beijing had only a few hundred warheads, which were mainly used as a deterrent. But new satellite images and intelligence reports suggest that China is expanding its missile fields and building new silos. In the long term, it could thus penetrate into the dimensions of the USA and Russia. For Washington, this expansion is a strategic alarm signal, as it undermines the previous bilateral structure of arms control. A world with three equal nuclear powers is more difficult to stabilize, as classic treaties and mechanisms can no longer simply be tailored to two actors. In addition to these developments, the role of regional conflicts grew. India and Pakistan have also engaged in several military conflicts in the 21st century, most recently in 2019 after a terrorist attack in Kashmir. Both countries have nuclear weapons, and both use their arsenals not only as a deterrent, but also as a political demonstration of power. Every incident carries the risk that an escalation will get out of control. Unlike in the Cold War, there is often a lack of communication channels or established red phones, so that the risk of wrong decisions is greater. The debate on nuclear terrorism also remained present. Although there was never a successful attack with an atomic bomb or dirty bomb, the fear remained. Security summits convened by Barack Obama in the 2010s were intended to strengthen international cooperation and secure stocks. Nevertheless, the rise of groups such as the Islamic State showed that radical ideologies and global uncertainties can create new threats at any time. The social dimension of nuclear weapons also changed. While mass movements protested against rearmament in the 1980s, today attention is often divided. Topics such as climate change, pandemics, or economic crises dominate the headlines, while the nuclear threat remains in the background, although it is more real than ever. Organizations such as ECON, which received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, are trying to raise public awareness of the issue again. They rely on the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which came into force in 2021. It prohibits the possession, use, and development of nuclear weapons, but without the participation of the actual nuclear powers, which limits its effect. The 21st century thus presents a contradictory picture. On the one hand, international efforts such as the Test Ban Treaty, the IAEA inspections, or the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons have set normative standards. On the other hand, geopolitical conflicts, modernization, and regional rivalries are undermining this progress. The danger has not diminished, but multiplied in many ways: new players, new technologies, new uncertainties. Looking back at the first 2 decades of the 21st century, it becomes clear that nuclear weapons have by no means lost their relevance. They are not only relics of the Cold War, but central elements of world politics. Whether as a threatening gesture in Europe, as insurance in North Korea, as a prestige project in China, or as a controversial issue in the Middle East, they shape the international system more than many want to admit. The new tensions consist in the fact that the world no longer knows a simple bipolarity, but a complex network of actors in which nuclear weapons play an uncertain but central role. So the central insight remains: even in the 21st century, humanity lives in the shadow of the bomb. The hope for disarmament and a nuclear weapon-free world has not disappeared, but it competes with the reality of new rivalries. The dream of security is repeatedly overshadowed by the logic of deterrence. Nuclear weapons are therefore not only a legacy of the past, but an open challenge for the present and the future. Chapter 20. Future without nuclear weapons? Since the first explosion in the New Mexico desert in July 1945, humanity has been accompanied by the question of whether it will ever again be able to live without nuclear weapons. This question is not only a technical or political one, but an existential one. Nuclear weapons have changed the world. They have prevented wars but also fueled fears. They have distributed power and created inequalities. They have shaped diplomacy and polarized societies. At the end of a long century of nuclear experience, humanity is once again asking itself the old question that has never been definitively answered: can there be a future without nuclear weapons, or is the bomb forever part of our world? Optimists point to the moral and political movement that has been fighting for disarmament for decades. Already after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, voices were formed calling for an end to the nuclear danger. Over the decades, a broad civil society emerged, which was organized into organizations, churches, trade unions, universities, and local initiatives. The major peace movements of the 1980s, the mass protests against Pershing II missiles, the global campaigns against testing and for treaties, all this shows that resistance to nuclear weapons has never been extinguished. Recently, new generations have taken up this tradition, such as the Econ movement, which received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. Their commitment to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which came into force in 2021, is an expression of hope that humanity will not have to live with the bomb forever. But the realists, often called cynics, oppose this. They remind us that not a single nuclear power has ever seriously renounced its weapons, with the exception of South Africa in the 1990s. The United States and Russia still possess thousands of warheads, China is massively expanding, India and Pakistan are refining their systems, North Korea continues to test, and Israel is sticking to its policy of ambiguity. The bomb has long since ceased to be an exclusive tool of the superpowers, but has established itself in regional conflicts. As long as states see it as the ultimate insurance against threats, no treaty or moral argument will be enough to make it disappear completely. The debate about a nuclear weapon-free world therefore moves between ideal and reality. On the one hand, there is the argument of safety. The more weapons there are, the higher the risk of accidents, false alarms, or theft. Studies show that there have been several near-catastrophic incidents in history in which technical errors or human error almost triggered an escalation. A future without nuclear weapons would be a future without this permanent sword of Damocles. It would free up resources, foster trust, and reduce the risk of global suicide. On the other hand, however, there are the mechanisms of power politics. Nuclear weapons are not just weapons, they are symbols. They define who carries weight on the world stage. A permanent member of the UN Security Council is almost automatically a nuclear power. States like North Korea have shown that the bomb can force international attention that would otherwise be denied them. Democracies such as France or Great Britain also argue that their arsenals guarantee not only national security, but also international influence. In this logic, nuclear weapons are more than a means of defense, they are instruments for defining rank and status. The question of a future without nuclear weapons is therefore also a question of whether the international order can change fundamentally. A world in which no state has the bomb would have to reach a level of trust, cooperation, and transparency that is currently unattainable. It would have to develop mechanisms to immediately detect and sanction violations. It would have to offer all states credible security guarantees so that no one feels the urge to secretly arm themselves. In short, it would have to create a completely new architecture of security, beyond the logic of deterrence. A look at the existing initiatives shows that this path is difficult, but not impossible. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, has prevented dozens of other states from developing nuclear weapons for decades. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, even if it has not yet entered into force, has de facto prevented almost all countries from testing. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, has set a moral norm that, while not recognized by the nuclear powers, shifts international law in a direction that can create long-term pressure. All these steps are imperfect, but they show that the international community is not resigning itself to the status quo. At the same time, one should not underestimate the dangers that an uncoordinated path to a nuclear weapon-free future could entail. If weapons were hastily abolished without stable security structures in place, states could be tempted to secretly keep stocks or quickly develop new ones. In such a scenario, even a single fraudster would gain enormous power. That is why many experts emphasize that disarmament is only possible in small, verifiable steps. Trust must grow, technical surveillance systems must be improved, and international institutions need more authority. Another factor is technological development. With advances in areas such as artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, and hypersonic weapons, the strategic landscape is shifting. Some observers fear that new technologies could lower the inhibition threshold for use because they shorten warning times or strengthen defenses. Others argue that it is precisely technological complexity that could make the bomb obsolete, because conflicts are increasingly taking place in the digital or economic space. How these developments will affect the future of nuclear weapons remains open. For society, the question arises as to how strongly the fear of nuclear weapons will shape thinking in the future. In the 1950s to 1980s, the nuclear threat was omnipresent, in schools, in films, in political debates. Today, it is often overshadowed by issues such as climate change, migration, or pandemics. But the danger has not disappeared. Perhaps this is precisely where a new challenge lies. The bomb has become commonplace, almost invisible, and yet a single misstep is enough to endanger the survival of civilization. A future without nuclear weapons would also have to be a future in which society actively takes responsibility again and exerts pressure on politicians. The vision of a nuclear weapon-free world is therefore neither pure utopia nor tangible reality. It is a goal that is repeatedly invoked in international conferences, but rarely consistently pursued. It thrives on the tension between moral imperative and political reality. Whether humanity will ever take this step depends not only on treaties and institutions, but also on the collective will to replace the logic of fear with a logic of trust. Perhaps this will only become strong enough when humanity once again comes to the brink of catastrophe. Perhaps it takes a crisis that has a similarly formative effect as Hiroshima, Nagasaki, or the Cuban Missile Crisis to give the final impetus. But perhaps there will also be a gradual awareness that the bomb is not just an insurance policy, but a hostage that keeps us all in shackles. In the end, the question remains open, but it must not be suppressed. A future without nuclear weapons is not guaranteed, but it is possible. It requires courage, patience, diplomacy, and a new idea of security. Above all, it requires the insight that true security does not arise from the threat of annihilation, but from trust in cooperation. As long as this insight is missing, the bomb will remain. But as long as people believe in them and fight for them, there is still hope that humanity will one day find the courage to leave the nuclear age behind.